On the morning of January 30th, 1889, a servant knocked on a locked door at the Mayerling hunting lodge outside Vienna and received no answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. When they finally broke the door down, they found Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria dead on the bed, a gunshot wound to his right temple, and beside him, a 17-year-old girl named Mary Vetsera, who had been dead for several hours longer than him. Rudolf was 30 years old. He was heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the largest empire in Europe by number of nationalities, and somewhere in Vienna, still asleep, was his wife, who would not be told what had happened for another 3 hours, and who learned about it not from the emperor, not from the palace officials, not from anyone who thought she deserved a private moment, but from a court servant who blurted it out in a hallway. Her name was Stephanie. She was 24 years old. On the body they found a note addressed to her. She kept it for the rest of her life. It read, "You are delivered from my fatal presence." Read that again. Not goodbye, not I am sorry. You are delivered. As if 8 years of a marriage she had not chosen, an empire she had served, a body he had permanently damaged with his own disease, a daughter he had left fatherless, were a burden she should be relieved to put down. That note was the last thing Rudolf ever said to his wife. It was his final verdict on what he thought of her. The Habsburg court agreed with him. Before Stephanie had finished absorbing the news, the imperial machinery was already deciding who was responsible for the crown prince's state of mind. The Empress Elizabeth, Rudolf's mother, a woman who had never hidden her contempt for her daughter-in-law, converted that contempt into a verdict. Stephanie had failed to provide her husband with the emotional security he needed. Stephanie had driven him to this. Stephanie, who was 24 years old and had spent 8 years being infected with her husband's disease, humiliated at his hands, and systematically ignored by the court around her, was the reason the Crown Prince of Austria was dead. They would not let her go home. She asked. She begged. Belgium was 3 days away. She wanted to go back. The emperor said no. The court said no. The decision was made by men in rooms she was not permitted to enter, about a life she was not permitted to leave, and the answer was no, and she stayed, and she grieved in a palace that had already decided she was to blame for what she was grieving. That is the moment most people think this story begins. It is not where it starts. Because Mayerling was not the first disaster that walked through Stephanie's door and refused to leave. It was not even close to the worst thing the Habsburg family had done to her, and it was nowhere near the last. Before Rudolf died, she had already watched the one man she genuinely loved waste away from cancer while she stood beside him helpless. After Rudolf died, the court would offer her as a replacement wife to another Habsburg, the same man who would later be assassinated in Sarajevo and drag the entire world into the First World War. She would be physically pulled away from her own mother's coffin by her father's servants, forbidden from saying goodbye. She would lose her titles, her daughter, her inheritance, and her entire family, not because of tragedy, but because of a single defiant choice she made at 35 that the empire could not forgive. And she outlived every last piece of it. She outlived Rudolf by 56 years. She outlived the Habsburg Empire itself. She outlived every man who tried to define her life and every institution that tried to contain it. She died at 81 in a monastery in Hungary with the man she had chosen, and the empire that had once imprisoned her was already 27 years in its grave. The Mayerling legend made her a footnote. The failed wife. The woman who drove a prince to his death. The actual record of her life tells a completely different story. It has been sitting in her memoirs, in the Habsburg archives, and in the accounts of the people who knew her for over a century, waiting for someone to read it in the direction she actually deserved. This account does exactly that. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Stephanie Clotilde Louise Hermine Marie Charlotte was born on the 21st of May, 1864, at the Royal Palace of Laeken, outside Brussels, the third child and second daughter of Leopold II, King of the Belgians, and his wife, Marie Henriette, who was an Austrian archduchess by birth and a miserable woman by circumstance. The birth was received at court with the specific disappointment that the birth of a second daughter receives in dynasties organized around male succession, and the disappointment was noted by the infant's father in the manner that Leopold II noted most things that failed to meet his requirements, which was the manner of a man who had decided that the world existed to serve his purposes, and who processed its occasional failures to do so as personal affronts rather than as the ordinary operations of chance. Leopold II of Belgium was, in 1864, 4 years into the reign that would make him one of the most consequential and most destructive monarchs of the 19th century. The world knew him then as the constitutional sovereign of a small Western European kingdom, a man of considerable charm and considerable ambition, who had spent his years as Duke of Brabant studying the colonial enterprises of other nations, with the specific attention of someone who had decided that colonialism was the mechanism by which a small kingdom converted itself into something larger, and that Belgium's failure to possess a colony was a failure of imagination. The imagination he applied to the problem was not the imagination of an explorer or an administrator. It was the imagination of a financier, organized entirely around the question of what a piece of African territory could produce for the person who controlled it. The Congo would not come until 1885, when the Berlin Conference handed Leopold personal control of a territory 80 times the size of Belgium, a decision the European powers would spend the following 2 decades slowly understanding the consequences of. In 1864 it was still a project under development, and the man developing it was the father who received the news of Stephanie's birth, with the specific assessment of a person who had been hoping for something more useful. The childhood that Leopold II and Marie Henriette produced for their children was the childhood of people who were performing a family rather than constituting one, and the performance was conducted in the specific register of the 19th century European royal household, which was the register of duty and formality and the management of appearance at the expense of everything that the management required to be suppressed. Marie Henriette was the Archduchess of Austria, the daughter of the Archduke Joseph Anton, who had founded the Hungarian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, and her marriage to Leopold had been arranged in 1853 with the specific logic of the dynastic alliance, which was the logic of 2 institutions deciding that their respective interests were served by the connection rather than the logic of 2 people deciding they wanted to spend their lives together. They did not want to spend their lives together. They spent them together anyway, in the adjacent apartments and the shared public occasions of a royal marriage whose private reality was the reality of 2 people who had concluded, independently and early, that the other person was a source of obligation rather than of comfort. Leopold's mistresses were not a secret, because Leopold did not make them one. He treated the institution of royal marriage with the contempt of a man who understood it as a commercial arrangement, and who behaved toward its emotional content with the specific indifference of someone who has contracted for a service and who does not feel obligated to pretend that the contract includes anything beyond the service specified. Marie Henriette had contracted to produce heirs and to appear at state occasions and to manage the domestic operations of the royal household, and she fulfilled each of these obligations with the thoroughness of a woman whose Austrian formation had developed in her the specific quality of dutiful compliance that the Habsburg court produced in the women it formed. She fulfilled them without warmth from her husband, without the domestic ease that the performance of a functional marriage provides as its incidental product, and without the specific human acknowledgement that the person performing the obligations is a person rather than a function. Stephanie absorbed this household with the specific comprehensiveness of a child who has no other household to compare it to, and who therefore understands the household she inhabits as the definition of what households are. The definition she absorbed was the definition of the household as performance, of marriage as contract, of children as instruments of dynastic purpose, rather than as people whose own requirements might legitimately organize the household around themselves. Her own requirements, across the childhood years at Lycan and the other royal residences that the Belgian court's seasonal calendar required, were the requirements of a child with a serious mind, a talent for music, and the specific emotional intelligence of someone who has grown up reading rooms carefully, because reading rooms carefully is the survival skill of the child whose domestic environment does not provide the safety that would make careful reading unnecessary. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her as a child and as a young woman, not conventionally beautiful in the way that the period's standards required the daughters of kings to be beautiful. She was intelligent, which was not the same thing. She was well-read, which was not the quality the marriage market rewarded. She was observant, which was not the attribute that the display occasions of royal court life found most useful. And she was, by her own subsequent account, aware from a remarkably early age of the specific condition of the women in the royal world around her, which was the condition of instruments, and aware of the specific purpose the condition served, which was the purpose of the dynasties that required the instruments. Her mother's example was the most immediate available document of what that purpose looked like from the inside. Marie Henriette had come from Vienna as an 18-year-old archduchess and had spent the subsequent decades producing children, attending functions, and watching her husband conduct himself in ways that the court's social code required her not to acknowledge. The watching had produced in her the specific quality of contained bitterness that long performance of a role the performer did not choose produces in people who are intelligent enough to understand what they are performing and who have no available mechanism for performing something else. She found her consolations where she could, in her horses, which she rode with the skill and the passion of someone for whom physical activity provided the release that the social world did not permit, and in her children, to whom she was warmer than her own formation might have predicted, and in the specific human refuge of women friends whose company the court's calendar allowed her to maintain. Stephanie watched her mother's navigations and drew the conclusions that the watching produced, and the conclusions were the conclusions that intelligent daughters of unhappy mothers draw when the unhappiness is sufficiently legible to be read. That the institution of royal marriage was the institution that had produced her mother's condition, that the condition was not her mother's fault but the institution's, and that the institution was sufficiently powerful that the fault's location was irrelevant to the outcome. The conclusions did not help her when the time came, because the time came before she was old enough to act on the conclusions, and the acting on them was not in any case within the range of options that the dynastic logic of 1879 and 1880 made available to the second daughter of the King of the Belgians. The approaches began when Stephanie was 15. The European marriage market of the late 19th century operated with the specific efficiency of a market organized around the convergence of dynastic interests and the social logic of the period's understanding of when royal daughters were ready to be placed, and 15 was within the range that the market considered appropriate for the initiation of the process, even if 16 or 17 was the more usual age for its conclusion. Leopold II had been in conversation with the Austrian court about the possibility of a connection with the Habsburg heir apparent since at least 1879, when the specific question of who Crown Prince Rudolf would marry had become the question that the Austro-Hungarian court was actively managing rather than merely contemplating. Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph of Habsburg-Lorraine was born on the 21st of August 1858, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, and his birth had been received by the Habsburg court with the relief that a dynasty's only male heir's birth always receives, which was the relief of an institution that had been waiting for the continuation of its line, and that understood the continuation as the resolution of the specific anxiety that the absence of a male heir produces in institutions organized around male succession. He was, at the time of the first approaches to Leopold's court, 21 years old, 6 years Stephanie's senior, and by the accounts of people who observed him in the years immediately preceding his marriage, already in possession of the character that would eventually produce the Mayerling note. The character was the character of a man who had received from his own formation the specific compound that the Habsburg court produced in the people it formed, which was the compound of genuine intellectual ability and genuine emotional damage, combined in proportions that the court's requirements ensured were never adequately addressed. Rudolf was intelligent in the way that the observers of the period consistently noted, widely read, genuinely curious, possessed of political opinions that the court found inconvenient because they were the opinions of someone who had looked at the Habsburg system from inside and concluded that the system was failing. He wrote political essays under a pseudonym that argued for a more liberal constitutional arrangement than the emperor was prepared to countenance. He corresponded with journalists and politicians whose views his father would have found alarming, he thought, which was the one quality that the Habsburg court had never quite figured out how to manage in its heirs, and the thinking had produced, by the time he was 21, a man whose relationship to the role he was being groomed for was the relationship of someone who could see the role clearly and found the seeing profoundly depressing. He had also, by 21, already begun the conduct that the court managed by the specific method of not discussing it, which was the conduct of a young man who had discovered in the city of Vienna a world of entertainments that his formation had not prepared him to moderate, and that he was not attempting to moderate. The conduct was already documented in the private correspondence of the courtiers who observed it, which described a crown prince whose evenings had a regularity of dissipation that the court's medical establishment had begun to observe, and that the court's social management had begun to calculate the consequences of. The consequences were the consequences that dissipation of the specific kind Rudolf was engaged in produces in the body of the person engaged in it, and by 1880, when the negotiations with Leopold II were advancing toward the conclusion of an engagement, the consequences were the consequences that the court had decided were less important than the succession question, because the succession question was the institutional question and the medical consequences were the personal one, and the institutional always outweighed the personal in the Habsburg court's specific ordering of priorities. Leopold II's assessment of the match, conducted with the commercial thoroughness of a man who had spent 20 years studying the returns on investments of various kinds, was the assessment of a father who understood that the Emperor of Austria's heir was the most valuable available connection for the daughter of the King of the Belgians, and who was not going to allow the available information about the heir's conduct to interfere with the valuation. There was information available. The Belgian court had its channels, as all courts had their channels, and the channels had produced reports whose content gave Leopold reason to understand that the match was not without its complications. He understood the complications and proceeded with the match, and the proceeding was the act of a man for whom Stephanie's interests, and Stephanie's future, and Stephanie's body were instruments of his dynastic calculations, rather than considerations that might modify the calculations. Stephanie was not consulted in any meaningful sense. She was presented with the match as the arrangement that had been made was introduced to Rudolf at a series of formal occasions at which both parties performed the interest that the occasion required, and received from those occasions the impression of a young man who was charming, intelligent, and capable of making a woman feel that her presence in the room was the most important fact in it, which was the specific talent of someone whose formation had not produced in him the capacity for genuine intimacy, but had produced in him the capacity for its convincing simulation. She was 15 years old. The simulation was convincing. The engagement was announced in March 1880. The wedding was set for May 1881, 2 weeks after her 17th birthday, and the Empress Elizabeth received the news of her son's engagement to the Belgian princess with the warmth of someone who had been informed that her son was getting exactly what the succession required, and nothing that she had been hoping for, which was a daughter-in-law who might provide what her own marriage had not consistently provided, which was the specific human warmth that the court's formal requirements could be temporarily suspended for. The Empress had been hoping for someone warmer. What she got was Stephanie, and the Empress's disappointment in the getting was the first piece of the hostile relationship that would organize Stephanie's experience of the Habsburg court across the following decade, before Rudolf's death converted the hostility from an interpersonal difficulty into something that felt, from Stephanie's position, like the coordinated verdict of an institution that had decided she was to blame for everything. The wedding day was the 10th of May, 1881. Stephanie was 16 years and 354 days old. She was married in the Augustinerkirche, the parish church of the imperial court of the Habsburgs, in a ceremony attended by the most concentrated assembly of European royalty that the continent's event calendar had produced that year. She wore white. She smiled. She performed the occasion with the thoroughness that her Belgian formation had developed in her and that the occasion required. What happened that night, and in the days and weeks that followed, is what the next part of this account examines, in the terms that the available evidence supports, and that the romantic legend of the Mayerling years has consistently required not to be examined in those terms. The morning after the wedding, a lady-in-waiting knocked on the crown princess's door and found her in a state that the lady recorded in her private diary, in terms that the subsequent biographers who examined the Mayerling years drew on without quoting directly, because the terms were the terms of someone who had found a 16-year-old girl in the specific condition that a night with Rudolf of Habsburg produced in a girl who had not been adequately prepared for what a night with Rudolf of Habsburg would involve. The lady-in-waiting was experienced enough to understand what she was looking at, and discreet enough to record it in private, rather than report it through the channels that would have required the court to acknowledge it, and the court's acknowledgement was not something anyone in the Habsburg establishment had any interest in producing. The preparation Stephanie had received for her wedding night was the preparation that the royal courts of the late 19th century provided for their daughters, which was no preparation in any practical sense, and a great deal of preparation in the formal sense of the instruction in the duties and obligations of a royal consort that the Belgian court had administered across the preceding months of the engagement. The duties and obligations were the duties and obligations of the institutional role, the management of the court household, the performance of the public occasions, the production of the male heir that the succession required. The specific physical content of the transition from unmarried princess to married crown princess was not addressed in the instruction, because the instruction was the instruction of an institution, and the institution did not have a vocabulary for the physical content that it was prepared to deploy in advance of the occasion that required it. What the occasion required on the night of the 10th of May 1881 was what Stephanie subsequently described in her memoirs, published in 1935 under the title Je devais être impératrice, in the specific register of a woman who had waited 44 years to say something and who had decided that the saying, when it came, would be honest rather than diplomatic. She described Rudolf on their wedding night as brutal. The word is the word in the original French, and it is the word she chose rather than the word that euphemism would have supplied, and it stands in the memoir as the most precise available statement of the first night of a marriage that would spend the following 8 years producing variations on its opening theme. The brutality was not the simple brutality of ignorance, the clumsiness of a young man who had no understanding of the person he was with. Rudolf was 22, and he had spent the preceding years in Vienna in the specific education of the city's entertainments, and he was not without knowledge of the relevant subject matter. The brutality was the brutality of someone who had decided that the woman in the bed was the instrument of the succession, and that instruments were to be used in the manner that their purpose required, without the specific consideration that a person, rather than an instrument, would have warranted. The decision was not necessarily conscious. It was the expression of a formation that had taught him to regard women of his own class as one category and women outside his class as another, and that had not provided him with the specific education in the humanity of the woman he was marrying that a different formation might have supplied. Empress Elizabeth had not visited her daughter-in-law on the morning after the wedding. She had, by the accounts of the court ladies who observed the family in those first days, managed her relationship to the new crown princess with the specific quality of warmth that the formal occasions required, and the specific quality of distance that her private assessment of the match produced. The assessment had been negative from the beginning, and the negativity had been communicated through the court with the efficiency that the Empress's opinions always travelled through the Habsburg establishment, which was the efficiency of an institution whose senior members' preferences organized the behavior of the people below her without the preferences requiring formal statement. The ladies understood that the Empress found her daughter-in-law wanting. The ladies communicated this understanding to each other in the vocabulary of the court, and the vocabulary reached Stephanie with the clarity of something that has travelled through a system designed to transmit it. What Elizabeth found wanting was not any single quality, but the compound of qualities that constituted Stephanie's presence in the court's social world, which was the compound of intelligence without the specific charm that the intelligence might have generated if the charm had been cultivated alongside the intelligence, and seriousness without the saving grace of the social ease that serious people in court environments require to make their seriousness palatable to the people around them. Stephanie was not easy. She was not warm in the way that courts define warmth, which is the warmth of the person who makes the people around them comfortable, regardless of what the person actually feels, and the deficiency of this quality in a crown princess who was simultaneously failing to produce the male heir that the court required, was a deficiency that the court organized its assessment of her around. The failure to produce the male heir was not, in the first year of the marriage, the failure of the crown princess's body. She was pregnant within months of the wedding, and the pregnancy was the pregnancy that the court required, awaited, and managed with the specific institutional intensity of a dynasty that understood the production of a male heir as the primary function of the marriage it had arranged. The child was born on the 2nd of September, 1883, 2 years and 4 months after the wedding, and it was a girl. Archduchess Elizabeth Marie was healthy, was welcome as the first step toward the succession's continuation, and was not the boy the court had been waiting for. The court absorbed the girl with the diplomatic composure of an institution that had practice at absorbing disappointments and redirected its expectations toward the next pregnancy. The next pregnancy did not come. And the reason the next pregnancy did not come was the reason that Stephanie's memoirs and the biographies that drew on the medical evidence have established with sufficient consistency to constitute the historical record's settled understanding of what Rudolf transmitted to his wife in the years following their daughter's birth. Rudolf had syphilis. The transmission of the disease from a husband to a wife in the 19th century was not the unusual occurrence that the Romantic account of the Mayerling years has preferred to treat it as. The disease was endemic in the social world that Rudolf inhabited, among the men who inhabited it in the specific manner that he inhabited it, which was the manner of someone whose evenings in Vienna's entertainment districts produced the exposures that the district's specific commerce generated. He had contracted it before the marriage, or in its first years, and he had transmitted it to Stephanie, and the transmission had produced in her the specific gynecological consequences that syphilis in women produced before the era of adequate treatment, which were the consequences of the disease's progression through the reproductive system in the absence of effective intervention. The court knew. This is the piece of the medical history that the Romantic account has managed most carefully, because the knowledge of the court requires the acknowledgement that the institution, which had arranged the marriage, which had administered the formal preparation of the bride, which had managed the wedding and the household and the medical establishment of the crown princess, had known what was happening to Stephanie's body and had chosen to organize its management of the knowledge around the succession question rather than around the woman whose body the succession question was damaging. The court doctors who attended Stephanie in the years following Elizabeth Marie's birth understood what they were observing, and they communicated their understanding through the medical channels that the imperial household maintained, and the imperial household received the communications and managed them in the direction of the institutional interest, which was the interest in maintaining the marriage's functional appearance, while the medical reality it was concealing undermined its functional content. The Empress's response to the medical situation was the response that the Empress applied to most situations involving her daughter-in-law, which was the response organized around the conclusion that the situation was Stephanie's fault. Elizabeth had not wanted this match. She had received it as the institutional necessity that her husband and the court had determined it to be, and she had managed her relationship to it with the specific quality of the woman who performs the required acceptance while maintaining the private judgment that the acceptance has not revised. The private judgment was that Stephanie was insufficient for her son, and the medical situation provided the most concrete available evidence for the insufficiency, because the medical situation had produced an infertile crown princess who could not give the empire the male heir it required, and the infertility's cause was not the detail the court's management of the situation required to be widely understood. What was widely understood, in the court and in the social world adjacent to it, was that the crown princess had failed to produce a male heir. The failure was attributed, in the specific vocabulary that courts apply to the failures of their female members, to the female member rather than to the circumstances of the failure, and the attribution was the attribution of an institution that had no interest in examining the circumstances, because the examination of the circumstances would have required the examination of the crown prince, and the crown prince was the institution's heir, and the institution's investment, and the institution's continuity, and the institution did not examine its investments in the direction of their culpability. Rudolf's affairs in the years following Elizabeth Marie's birth were the affairs of a man who had decided that his marriage's emotional content was exhausted. and who was pursuing the replacement content in the specific direction that Vienna's social and cultural world made available to men of his position and his temperament. The affairs were not discreet. They were conducted in the specific manner of someone who had decided that discretion was less important than access, and the access was provided by the court's social world with the ease that the crown prince's position generated, because the women of Vienna's aristocracy and its entertainment world understood his position and understood what the position's access implied. He moved through a succession of attachments whose details the biographies have documented with varying degrees of completeness, and the movement produced in Stephanie the specific experience of someone who is being publicly replaced in a context that provides no mechanism for the replacement's acknowledgement or its address. She could not divorce him. Divorce in the Habsburg court of the 1880s was not an option available to a crown princess, because the Habsburgs were the most Catholic dynasty in Europe, and the sacrament of marriage was a sacrament rather than a contract, and the dissolution of a sacrament required the intervention of the Pope rather than the decision of the parties involved, and the Pope was not going to dissolve the marriage of the Habsburg heir to the Belgian king's daughter. The unavailability of divorce was the unavailability of the only mechanism that would have addressed the situation in the direction of Stephanie's interest, and its unavailability meant that the situation would be addressed in the direction of every other available interest, which was the direction of the succession and the court and the reputation and the institutional management of a marriage whose private reality the institutional management was organized around concealing. She asked Rudolf, in the years of the mid-1880s, for a separation. The accounts of the conversations that the biographies draw on, reconstructed from Stephanie's own memoir and from the testimony of people in the court who were aware of the state of the marriage, describe exchanges between two people who had long since ceased to inhabit the same emotional world, and who were managing their shared institutional obligation with the specific quality of professionals performing a role they no longer believed in. Rudolf declined the separation. His reasons, as documented in the accounts, were the reasons of someone who understood that a separated crown prince and crown princess was a public relations problem of the specific kind that the Habsburg court did not have the institutional machinery to manage, and who preferred the continuation of the marriage's formal existence to the exposure of its actual state. So it continued. The household continued. The official appearances continued, the two of them at the theatre, at the opera, at the state occasions that the court calendar required, presenting the performance of the imperial marriage to the audiences that the performance was designed to produce. And behind the performance, Stephanie was managing the specific daily reality of someone who is living inside a contract whose terms she did not negotiate and cannot exit, in a household whose head is simultaneously her husband, her social prison, and the source of the disease that had removed from her the one function the institution regarded as her primary purpose. In October 1888, she returned from a trip to Greece and encountered Rudolf at the Hofburg, and the encounter produced in her the description that she preserved in her memoirs, and that this account considers among the most significant available documents of the final months before Mayerling. She wrote that she was horrified as soon as she set eyes on the crown prince. His decay was so greatly advanced as to have become conspicuous. He was frightfully changed. His skin was flaccid, his eyes were restless, his expression had completely changed. It seemed as if his lineaments had lost their inner substance, as if a process of internal dissolution were going on. The woman who wrote that description was not the woman who had failed her husband. She was the woman who had observed him across 8 years of proximity, and who was describing, with the precision of someone who had been watching the dissolution for a long time, what the dissolution had finally reached. She was also, by the date of the description, genuinely frightened, not for herself, but for the institution she had been installed to serve, and for the man she had stopped loving and started pitying, and the fear produced in her the decision to act that the court's management of the situation had never prompted the court to take. She asked for an audience with Emperor Franz Joseph. She told him that his son was in danger. She told him that the dissolution she had observed required intervention. The emperor received her warning with the courtesy of a man who had been managing his son's conduct for 20 years and who had reached his own assessments of the situation's limits, and he did not act on the warning in the manner or with the urgency that Stephanie's account indicates that she believed the warning warranted. 3 months later, she woke up in Vienna on the morning of the 30th of January 1889, and a court servant blurted something in a hallway, and the door to the hunting lodge had already been broken down, and the note was already waiting for her. "You are delivered from my fatal presence." She was delivered into something considerably worse. 6 months before Mayerling, Rudolf of Habsburg approached a woman named Midzi Kaspar and made her a proposal. Midzi was a prominent courtesan of Vienna, a woman of considerable social intelligence who had been one of Rudolf's regular companions for years and who understood the Crown Prince's state of mind with the specific accuracy of someone who had spent considerable time in proximity to it. The proposal he made was not the proposal of a man offering a future. It was the proposal of a man who had decided he had no future and who was looking for someone to share the exit. He asked her to die with him. Midzi Kaspar refused. She did so directly, practically, and with the specific common sense of a woman who had no interest in being dead. She also, according to the account she later gave to the police in the weeks following Mayerling, went to the police after the conversation and told them what Rudolf had said to her, because she was alarmed enough by the conversation to believe that the Crown Prince of Austria expressing a desire to die was information that the relevant authorities should possess. The relevant authorities received the information and filed it and did not act on it. Because the relevant authorities were the authorities of the Habsburg court, and the Habsburg court's management of the Crown Prince's psychological condition was the management of an institution that had decided the condition was a private matter rather than an institutional emergency. The Crown Prince then made the same proposal to a 17-year-old girl named Marie Vetsera. Marie Vetsera was the daughter of an Austro-Hungarian diplomat, a girl of the specific social position that places a person adjacent to the court's world without placing her inside it, and her attachment to Rudolf had begun in April 1888, 9 months before Mayerling, in the specific manner of a young woman of 17 who has been introduced to the most famous man in Austria, and who has found the introduction organized itself into an obsession. She was genuinely devoted to him. Rudolf told people who knew him in the final months that he was not in love with her, but that he was taken by her devotion, which is the testimony of a man describing his relationship to someone he was using as an instrument of his exit, rather than as the object of an attachment he was unwilling to survive. The distinction is the distinction that the romantic account of Mayerling has spent 130 years obscuring, because the romantic account is organized around the lover's pact, and the pact requires 2 willing parties, and the evidence for the willingness of one of the parties is the evidence of a 17-year-old's obsession with the most powerful man she knew, rather than the evidence of 2 people who had reached the same conclusion by independent routes. By January 1889, Rudolf's dissolution, which Stephanie's October memoir entry described in the terms that Part 2 of this account examined, had reached the stage that the people closest to him were documenting in private correspondence as the terminal stage. His health was visibly failing. His political frustrations had produced in him the specific despair of someone who had watched every liberal initiative he cared about crushed by his father's conservatism, and his personal life had reached the configuration that the preceding 8 years had been building toward, which was the configuration of a man who had destroyed his marriage and his body and his political prospects, and who was managing the wreckage with the specific combination of morphine and alcohol that the period made available to members of his class who were managing similar wrecks. He arrived at the Mayerling hunting lodge on the 28th of January 1889, in the Vienna woods about 25 miles southwest of the capital, with a small household staff and the specific purpose of a few days hunting away from the court. Marie Vetsera arrived separately, having been smuggled to the lodge through an arrangement that the people who managed it found unremarkable in the context of the Crown Prince's conduct, and she and Rudolf were alone in the lodge bedroom from the evening of the 28th through the morning of the 30th, when the door was broken down. What happened between those hours has been the subject of continuous investigation and argument for 135 years, and the investigation has produced, across that time, everything from the official suicide pact conclusion, to the murder theory, to the political assassination hypothesis, to the accidental death framework, and none of the frameworks has been established with sufficient documentary precision to exclude the others. because the management of the crime scene in the hours following the discovery was the management of a court that was making institutional decisions about what would be known and what would not. And the decisions it made in those hours produced an evidentiary record whose incompleteness is the most precise available document of what the court had decided. The official account, which was the account the Habsburg court produced and maintained for decades, was the account of a suicide pact. Rudolf had shot Marie Vetsera, and then himself, in the sequence that the note he left to Stephanie and the other notes found at the scene indicated he had intended. The notes were the court's primary evidence for the pact theory, and the notes were genuine in the sense that they were in Rudolf's hand and contained the specific content that the pact theory required. The note to Stephanie, which this account's hook established in its essential phrase, was the note of a man describing his death as his wife's liberation. The notes to other family members were the notes of a man who had planned what he was doing and who was performing, in the final hours, the specific courtesy of the addressed communication that people who are planning their deaths sometimes perform. The Empress Zita, who was the last Empress of Austria-Hungary, the wife of Karl I, who ruled from 1916 until the empire's collapse in 1918, spent decades asserting in private, and eventually in public, that Rudolf had not killed himself, but had been murdered. Her account, which she repeated to her children and to biographers across the long years of her own exile, located the murder in the political context that Rudolf's activities had generated, the liberal political essays, the connections with French and Hungarian nationalist circles, the specific threat that a crown prince with oppositional politics represented to the conservative establishment his father had maintained. She named French agents and Austrian conservatives as the possible perpetrators in formulations that varied across the decades of the telling, and that the historians who examined the claim most carefully have found compelling in outline and elusive in proof. The 2015 forensic examination of Marie Vetsera's remains, conducted after her grave was found to have been disturbed, produced a finding that the Zeta theory's proponents cited as support. The forensic analysis found no bullet hole in the skull that the suicide pact theory required to be there, and found instead evidence of traumatic injury inconsistent with a self-inflicted gunshot at the angle that a suicide produces. The finding was contested by other forensic experts, and the material examined was in a condition that the century and a quarter of its interment had compromised sufficiently to produce the competing readings that the competing experts produced. What it established, beyond the contested forensics, was that the remains had been disturbed before the formal examination, which was itself the evidence of a management operation conducted on the physical evidence of Mayerling in ways that the official account had not disclosed. The management of Marie Vetsera's body in the hours following the discovery is the specific dimension of the Mayerling aftermath that the court's conduct most thoroughly indicts. Her mother, Baroness Helene Vetsera, was told of her daughter's death by the police in a communication that included the instruction that she was to tell no one. She was not permitted to see the body. She was not permitted to grieve publicly, because public grief for Marie Vetsera would have required the public acknowledgement that Marie Vetsera had been at Mayerling, and the court had decided that the acknowledgement was not in the institutional interest. The body was removed from the lodge by two of Rudolf's aides, who dressed it in travelling clothes, placed it in a carriage, and transported it to the Heiligenkreuz Abbey for burial, in the manner of a person who had died of entirely natural causes, propped between the two men to prevent it from falling during the journey. A 17-year-old girl, dressed and seated like a living passenger for the last trip she would ever make. The burial at Heiligenkreuz was conducted at night, quickly, without ceremony, in the presence of the minimum number of people that the logistics of the disposal required. Marie Vetsera's mother was not present. She would not be permitted to visit the grave for months. The girl who had been at the center of the most dramatic death in the Habsburg court's modern history was erased from the official account of it with the thoroughness that the court applied to the erasure of inconvenient facts, and the erasure was so complete that the romantic legend of Mayerling, which made her the central figure of the story, was itself a form of posthumous rehabilitation of someone the court had initially decided was not to be acknowledged as a person who had existed. Stephanie was in Vienna on the morning of January 30th. She was in the Hofburg, having not accompanied Rudolf to the hunting lodge, in the routine of the imperial household's winter calendar. She learned of her husband's death, as the hook of this account established, from a servant who blurted the information in a hallway, which is to say she learned of it in the worst available manner, at the worst available time, with the worst available preparation, which was no preparation, because no one in the Habsburg court had decided that the crown princess was entitled to the consideration of a prepared communication delivered by a person whose function was to communicate things of this kind. The note was brought to her. She read it. "You are delivered from my fatal presence." She held the note. She kept it. The keeping of it for the remaining 56 years of her life is itself a document, because people keep things that contain the information they need to keep available, and the information that Rudolf's note contained was the information of what the marriage had been and what it had cost, stated in the husband's own hand, available for consultation whenever the court and the press and the popular memory of the Mayerling legend required reminding that the crown prince's final statement about his wife was the statement of a man describing her as a burden he was removing. Franz Joseph received the news at his breakfast table. He was described by the people present as receiving it with the specific composure of a man who had spent 60 years performing composure in the face of events that required it, and who had developed the performance to the point where the composure and the feeling had become one and the same thing, because the development had consumed the feeling in the production of the composure. He said, "I have been spared nothing." And then he asked for his papers. The court met. The decisions were made. The official version was constructed, in the hours and days immediately following the discovery, with the specific efficiency of an institution that had extensive practice at constructing official versions and that understood what the official version needed to say and what it needed not to say. The needs were the needs of the Habsburg dynasty's reputation, the needs of the Austrian Catholic Church's relationship to a suicide in the imperial family, and the needs of the political situation that the heir apparent's death had created by removing the heir apparent. The needs were not Stephanie's needs. Stephanie's needs were not among the considerations that the official version's construction incorporated. The Catholic Church presented an immediate problem, because a suicide in a Catholic family of the Habsburgs' institutional prominence required the Pope's involvement, and the Pope's involvement required the transmission of information to the Vatican that the Habsburg court was simultaneously attempting to control. The Emperor sent a special envoy to Rome. The envoy communicated the version of events that the court had constructed, and the Vatican, with the specific institutional intelligence of an organization that understood when its interests and the Habsburg interests coincided, granted the dispensation that allowed Rudolf to be buried in the imperial crypt rather than in unconsecrated ground. The dispensation was granted on the grounds that the crown prince had been in a state of mental disturbance that diminished his moral responsibility for his act. The grounds were the grounds that served both institutions, and the serving of both institutions was the outcome that the envoy's mission had been organized to produce. Stephanie was given no role in any of these decisions. She was the widow, she was the crown princess, she was the woman to whom the last note had been addressed, and she was not consulted about the version, the burial, the dispensation, or any of the institutional decisions that the days following her husband's death required. She was the person the decisions were being made about rather than the person they were being made by, and the distinction was the distinction that had organized her entire relationship to the Habsburg court since the engagement had been announced in March 1880, and that would organize her relationship to it for the 11 years that followed Mayerling. The Empress Elizabeth, who had been in Munich when Rudolf died, and who rushed to Vienna on learning the news, was in grief that the people around her described as the grief of a woman who had lost something she could not replace, and whose loss revealed the specific shape of the attachment she had never expressed adequately while the attachment's object was alive. She was in public grief and in private accusation, and the accusation was the accusation this account has already established. Stephanie had failed her son. The grief and the accusation were not in tension with each other in Elizabeth's rendering of the situation. They were two expressions of the same thing, which was the refusal of a mother to locate the responsibility for her son's death in the person who bore it, and the allocation of the responsibility to the person who was present and available, and against whom the allocation cost the allocator nothing, because Stephanie was the Dowager Crown Princess now, and the Dowager Crown Princess had no power to resist the Empress's verdict. They were not finished with her. That was the specific discovery of the weeks following Mayerling. They were not going to let her grieve, or leave, or be left alone, or be treated as someone whose experience of the preceding 8 years warranted any acknowledgement beyond the formal condolences of the institution that had arranged the experience. They were going to keep her, because keeping her served the institutional interest, and the institutional interest was, as it had always been, the only interest the Habsburg court had ever been organized to serve. The morning after the funeral, Stephanie asked to go home. The request was directed to Emperor Franz Joseph, who was now the most powerful available authority in her life, and who had assumed, along with the formal condolences he had offered, and the institutional management of the Mayerling aftermath he had directed, the specific role of the person who controlled what happened to the Dowager Crown Princess. She asked him to permit her to return to Belgium, not permanently, she was careful to specify, but temporarily, for the recovery that the preceding weeks had made necessary, and that Vienna's specific atmosphere, organized as it was around the court's verdict on her role in her husband's death, was making impossible. She was 24 years old, her husband had been dead for less than a month, she wanted to go home. The emperor said no. The reason was not stated in the form of a reason, because the Habsburg court's management of its members' movements did not require the statement of reasons when the movements were being refused rather than permitted. What the court communicated instead was the institutional position, which was the position that the Dowager Crown Princess's presence in Vienna was required by the obligations of her position, and that the obligations of her position were the obligations of the woman who had been the heir's wife, and who remained the heir's daughter's mother, and who was therefore bound to the court by the specific institutional ties that her rank imposed. She could not simply return to Brussels. She had ceased to be a Belgian princess who had come to Vienna and had become, through the marriage and the years, a member of the Habsburg household, and the household's management of her movement was the household's prerogative rather than her own. Queen Victoria, who was conducting from Windsor Castle the specific royal surveillance of the European continent's dynastic situations that she regarded as among her primary professional responsibilities, sent an invitation to Stephanie in the weeks following Mayerling. The invitation was the invitation of a woman who understood what Stephanie was experiencing and who had the specific combination of power and sympathy that the experience warranted, and who was extending to the Dowager Crown Princess the offer of the English court's company as an alternative to the specific hostility of the Viennese one. The invitation was declined on Stephanie's behalf. It was declined by the court rather than by Stephanie, because the court was managing Stephanie's correspondence with the thoroughness of an institution managing a resource it was not prepared to release to competing claims on its availability. The resource metaphor is not excessive. Stephanie's value to the Habsburg court in the months following Mayerling was not the value of a person, but the value of a symbol, the visible presence of the Dowager Crown Princess performing her widowhood in the public occasions of the imperial capital in the manner that the court's management of the Mayerling aftermath required. The performance was the performance of a dignified grief, conducted in the appropriate mourning dress, at the appropriate occasions, with the appropriate composure that the court's expectations of its female members demanded, regardless of what the composure was managing. The composure managed, in Stephanie's case, a grief considerably more complicated than the grief of a wife who had loved her husband and lost him, because the grief was the grief of someone whose marriage had been the specific compound of disease and abandonment and public humiliation that the preceding parts of this account have established, and who was now required to perform the mourning of that compound in public, in black, at court occasions, while the institution around her communicated, through its social machinery, its settled judgment that the compound was her fault. The Elizabeth problem was the most acute dimension of the court's hostility in the months immediately following Mayerling. Empress Elizabeth had reorganized her grief around the specific conclusion that Stephanie had failed her son, and the reorganization was not a private conviction maintained in the privacy of the Empress's apartments. It was communicated through the court's social channels with the efficiency that the Empress's opinions always traveled, and the communication produced in the court's daily social life the specific atmosphere of a verdict that everyone understood and that no one was required to state directly, because the stating was unnecessary in an environment where the Empress's feelings on any subject were legible to everyone within her orbit, without the feelings requiring verbal expression. Stephanie's position at court in this atmosphere was the position of the found guilty. She was not excluded from the formal occasions that her rank required her to attend, because exclusion would have required a formal act that the court was not prepared to make public. She was included instead, which was worse, because inclusion in an environment that has decided you are to blame for its primary grief is the specific social condition of someone who is present at every occasion and acknowledged at none, who appears in the room and produces in it the specific quality of a lowered temperature that the presence of the blamed always produces in the environment of those doing the blaming. She attended, she performed, she absorbed. The travelling was what preserved her, in the years of 1889 and 1890, from the specific breakdown that the absorbed hostility might otherwise have produced. The court could not prevent her from travelling within the Habsburg lands, and the Habsburg lands were large enough to provide, in their various corners, the relief of environments that were not the Hofburg, and the people who were not the court ladies, and the courtiers, whose social performance of the Empress's verdict organized the daily life of Vienna's upper world. She went to the Tyrol, to Croatia, to the Adriatic coast, to the Greek lands that the empire bordered, and the Mediterranean that lay beyond them. She took painting lessons, which gave her the specific occupation of someone who is trying to find in creative work the thing that the available social world is not providing, which is the absorption of concentrated attention in something that produces results independent of the approval of the people around her. And she had, in those months of 1889, the specific anchor that the hook of this account mentioned, and that this part examines in the detail it deserves, because Count Artur Potocki was the person who preserved Stephanie's capacity for trust in a year that had given her very little reason to maintain it. Potocki had entered Stephanie's life in the summer of 1887, 2 years before Mayerling, at a point in the marriage when Stephanie's patience with Rudolf's public conduct had reached the specific limit that 8 years of patience produces. When the patience has been organized around the performance of a function the performer has concluded is not serving any purpose she values. She had, by 1887, stopped expecting anything from the marriage that the marriage was not already providing, which was the company of a man who found her presence useful for the succession and inconvenient for everything else. And she had begun the specific reorientation of her emotional life around what was available rather than what the marriage required her to pretend was available. What was available was Artur Potocki, who was 38 years old, to Stephanie's 23, a Polish nobleman of the specific formation that the Polish aristocracy of the period produced in its best examples, which was the formation of someone who had received an education organized around literature and music, and the specific quality of serious conversation that the 19th century's cultivated European class knew how to conduct when it was not managing the performance of its social position. He had read things. He thought about what he read. He was capable of talking to Stephanie in the register she had grown up wanting to be talked to in, and had found almost entirely unavailable since the wedding, which was the register of a person who was treating her as an intelligence worth engaging, rather than as an obligation worth managing. She called him Hamlet. The code name was the code name of someone who had understood that the affair required the management of its own privacy, which was the management that the sister Louise provided as the intermediary, through whose correspondence the contact was maintained, in the periods when the court's surveillance of the crown princess's social life was most thorough. Louise was the older sister, the one who understood Stephanie's situation with the sympathy of someone who had her own experience of the specific conditions of being a royal daughter, and who provided the channel without asking questions, whose answers she preferred not to possess. The affair was conducted with the discretion that Rudolf's conduct had never managed, which is not an incidental comparison. Stephanie had watched her husband's public dissipation for 8 years, and had observed the specific cost of the absence of discretion in someone who did not consider discretion necessary, and the observation had produced in her the specific understanding that the affairs she might conduct would require the quality that Rudolf's had consistently lacked. She was discreet. The court knew, in the specific way that courts know things that are conducted discreetly, which is through inference and rumor rather than through documentation. But the knowledge was the knowledge of inference rather than of proof, and the inference was not acted on in any formal way, because the formal acting on it would have required the acknowledgement that the court preferred not to make. What Potocki gave Stephanie across the 2 years of the affair's existence before Mayerling, and across the months of his sustained presence in her life after it, was what the word anchor, which this account has used deliberately, is meant to convey: the specific human gravity of someone who holds the person they are attached to the ground when the ground itself is shifting. He came to Vienna when she needed him to come. He wrote when the visiting was impossible. He was present at the specific quality of presence that means something different from physical proximity, which is the presence of a person who has decided that the relationship's requirements are the first priority over the other claims on his time and attention, and who organizes his availability accordingly. Mayerling made his presence the most urgent available fact of Stephanie's emotional life. Rudolf's note had told her she was delivered. Potocki's conduct told her something different, which was that delivery from one thing does not mean abandonment by everything, and the telling was the thing she most needed in the weeks and months of 1889, when the court was delivering its verdict, and the Empress was conducting her campaign, and the permission to go home was being refused, and the Victoria invitation was being declined on her behalf. She wrote to her sister Louise, in the months following Rudolf's death, the letters that biographers have examined and quoted in the available accounts of this period, and in one of the letters, she wrote that Potocki was her best friend. She used the words without the specific romantic vocabulary that the relationship also warranted, because the letter was a letter, and the letters traveled through channels that the court's management of her correspondence could access, and the vocabulary of friendship was the vocabulary that the channel could receive without the receiving requiring action. But the feeling behind the vocabulary was the feeling that the vocabulary was managing, and the feeling was the feeling that the subsequent development made legible in retrospect, which was the feeling of someone whose emotional life had organized itself around a single available person, and who would experience the loss of that person as the loss of the last available thing. In 1890, approximately 1 year after Mayerling, Artur Potocki was diagnosed with laryngeal cancer. The diagnosis was the diagnosis of a disease whose course, in the medical context of 1890, was not the course of a condition with a survivable outcome. The larynx was the organ that the disease had reached, and the reaching of it produced in the person whose larynx it had reached the specific sequence of the disease's progression that the medical understanding of 1890 was not equipped to interrupt. He declined across the months of the diagnosis with the specific quality that the accounts of people who visited him in those months describe, which was the quality of a man who understood what was happening to him, and who was conducting his declining with the dignity that Stephanie would have recognized from the specific formation she had observed in him across 3 years. He died in March 1890. He was 41 years old. The year had taken from Stephanie her husband in January 1889, and her lover in March 1890, and the two losses, arriving within 14 months of each other, were the losses that the subsequent 11 years of her widowhood at the Habsburg court would be organized around managing. She wrote to Louise after Potocki's death, and the letter, in the portions that the biographers have quoted, contains the sentence that this account established in its opening section: "I have lost my best friend." The sentence was written by a 25-year-old woman who had buried 2 of the men in her life within 14 months, and who was living in a court that blamed her for the first burial and was indifferent to the second. The court had other plans for her. The specific other plans the court was developing in the same period, the candidate they had identified for the next match, and who that candidate was, and what eventually happened to him, is the most extraordinary irony that Stephanie's life contains, and it belongs in the next part of this account rather than this one, because the irony requires its own space, and the space requires the full dimensions of what the candidate subsequently became. He was a Habsburg, he was the new heir, and on the 28th of June 1914, in Sarajevo, he was shot. In the early 1890s, the Habsburg court turned its attention to the question of what to do with Stephanie, and the question had the specific urgency that the court applied to all questions involving the management of its female members, whose situation had become inconvenient, which was the urgency of an institution that preferred solutions to the alternative. The solution the court identified was the solution it applied to inconvenient widows of childbearing age in general, remarriage, and specifically remarriage into the dynasty or into a connection that the dynasty found advantageous. The candidate the court had in mind was the candidate that the succession's new configuration had produced, because Mayerling had done more than kill Rudolf. It had reorganized the entire question of who would one day sit on the Habsburg throne, and the reorganization had elevated to the position of heir presumptive, a man whose character and circumstances the dynasty was already finding complicated in ways that the dynasty had not anticipated, when the complication's source was still merely an archduke rather than the heir. Archduke Franz Ferdinand Karl Ludwig, Joseph Maria of Austria-Este, was born in 1863, 1 year before Stephanie, the eldest son of Archduke Karl Ludwig, who was Franz Joseph's brother, which made Franz Ferdinand the emperor's nephew. He was 26 years old when Rudolf died, and the death that elevated him to the succession was a death he had not expected, and for which his formation had not prepared him, in the specific way that the formations of men who are not designated as primary heirs do not prepare them for the weight of the primary position. He was, by the accounts of the period, a man of considerable personal energy and considerable personal difficulty, someone whose intelligence was genuine and whose temper was the temper that the Habsburg formation produced in the men it formed, who had not been taught adequate management of it, which was the temper of someone who was frequently right, and who expressed the rightness with insufficient regard for the feelings of the people who were being shown how wrong they were. He was also, in the early 1890s, not yet attached. The dynasty's interest in pairing him with Stephanie was the interest of an institution that saw in the combination of the new heir and the previous heir's widow a specific dynastic utility. Stephanie was proven, in the sense that she had already produced a child and had demonstrated the capacity for the function the succession required, and she was already inside the Habsburg family's social world, which meant that the introduction and the assessment and the management of the match had already been accomplished by the previous arrangement. The court's calculation was the calculation of a dynasty that was managing a succession problem and that had identified in its inventory of available women the one who was most ready to be deployed. The proposal was communicated to Stephanie through the channels that such proposals traveled in the Habsburg court, which were not the direct channels of two people being introduced and left to form their own assessment, but the indirect channels of intermediaries who communicated the institution's interest and assessed the recipient's readiness before the formal proposal could be made. What Stephanie received through those channels was the information that the court had identified a candidate and that the candidate was the new heir, and her response to the information was the response of a woman who had spent the preceding months burying one man and grieving another, and who had absorbed, from those burials, the specific education of someone who has learned what marriages contracted for dynastic utility, rather than for personal compatibility, actually contain. She declined. The declining was the act of a 26-year-old woman with a title and a daughter and a dead husband and a dead lover, and 11 years of intimate knowledge of what the Habsburg court did to the women it collected, and the declining was not the declining of someone who was making a romantic choice. It was the declining of someone who had done the calculation that the preceding decade had equipped her to do, and who had reached the conclusion that the result was not a calculation she was prepared to make again. Franz Ferdinand received the information of her declining without recorded comment, which is the response of a man who was managing a great many difficulties simultaneously, and who had decided that this particular difficulty was not the one requiring his primary attention. He had other concerns, and the concerns would organize themselves, across the following years, into the most consequential relationship of his adult life, which was his attachment to Sophie Chotek, a Czech countess of insufficient rank, for the connection to be straightforward and of sufficient personal quality for Franz Ferdinand to have decided that the insufficiency of rank was a problem to be managed rather than an obstacle to be accepted. The management of the Sophie Chotek problem occupied the Habsburg court for years, in the specific way that the Habsburg court occupied itself with problems involving the rank of the women its male members wanted to marry, which was the way of an institution that had codified its understanding of who was acceptable and who was not, in terms that the individuals involved were not empowered to modify regardless of their personal feelings about the modification's necessity. Sophie was not Habsburg, she was not royal, she was a lady-in-waiting, which was a position the court had designed for women of the specific social standing that placed them inside the court's social world, while maintaining the clear distinction between the people who were born to the dynasty and the people who served it. Franz Ferdinand's decision to pursue the connection regardless was the decision of a man of considerable will, applied to a situation of considerable institutional resistance, and the institutional resistance was formidable. He had to renounce any children of the marriage from the line of succession before the emperor would permit it. He stood in front of the assembled senior members of the Habsburg dynasty on the 28th of June 1900 and swore the morganatic oath, which was the oath of a man accepting that the woman he was about to marry would never be his equal in the dynasty's terms, and that their children would never inherit the throne he would one day occupy. He swore it in the presence of the emperor who had required it, and the archdukes who were witnesses to it, and the institutional machinery that had produced it, and then he went and married Sophie Chotek, and the marriage was by every available account the marriage of two people who had decided to be genuinely happy with each other, in defiance of the institution's assessment of what happiness was worth in dynastic terms. Stephanie watched Franz Ferdinand's marriage from the position of someone who had declined to be in Sophie's place, and the watching produced in her the specific reaction that the subsequent development of her own life illuminates more clearly than any direct statement she made about it. She had declined the proposal that would have placed her at the center of the Habsburg court's succession again, in the position of the new heir's wife, the position that Sophie Chotek occupied through the morganatic arrangement. She had declined it because she had concluded that the position was not worth its price. The subsequent years would demonstrate that the conclusion was correct, in ways that went beyond anything her 1890s calculation had been able to anticipate. On the 28th of June 1914, on a street in Sarajevo, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots into the open car, carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. The first shot struck Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein, the second struck Sophie in the abdomen. They died within the hour, in the governor's residence, Sophie first, Franz Ferdinand shortly after. He is reported to have said to her, in the moments when both were still alive, "Sofril, Sofril, don't die, stay alive for the children." She was dead before he finished. The assassination produced the sequence of mobilizations and declarations that the summer of 1914 converted into the First World War, and the First World War produced the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, and the collapse of the Habsburg Empire produced the end of the world that had arranged Stephanie's first marriage and managed her widowhood and refused her permission to go home. The institution that had kept her was destroyed by the consequence of the death of the man she had refused to marry, and the destruction was the destruction of everything she had been shaped by and against. And it came 24 years after her refusal, and 14 years into the marriage she had contracted on her own terms against the institution's wishes. Stephanie's reaction to the Sarajevo news in 1914 is not documented in any source this account has found, in the form of a direct recorded response. She was 50 years old, living in the Rusovce castle in Hungary, with the husband she had chosen in 1900, and what she thought when she heard that Franz Ferdinand was dead is the private account that the private record does not contain in a form accessible to examination. What the public record contains is the subsequent trajectory of the empire whose institutional life had organized her personal one, and the trajectory requires only its conclusion to make the point that the conclusion makes, which is the point that the institution that had controlled her was brought down by the death of the man whose death she had contributed to preventing by declining the proposal that would have placed her at his side. She did not cause Sarajevo. The statement requires saying, because it is the statement that the logical structure of the argument might appear to be reaching toward, and the reaching would be dishonest. What she did was make a private decision for private reasons, and the private decision's public consequences were the consequences of a chain of events that her decision contributed one link to, and that the other links would have assembled with or without her contribution. Franz Ferdinand would have met Sophie Chotek whether or not Stephanie had accepted the proposal. He would have contracted the morganatic marriage. He would have been in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. He would have been shot. What the irony actually is examined honestly rather than romantically, is the irony of an institution's planning meeting its own destruction through the consequences of the planning. The Habsburg court had identified Stephanie as the solution to its succession problem in the early 1890s, and the solution had declined to be the solution, and the declining had contributed to the configuration that placed Franz Ferdinand in the position that ended in Sarajevo, and Sarajevo had ended the institution whose planning had produced the problem in the first place. The institution had been outwitted, not by Stephanie's planning, because she had no planning beyond the decision to refuse, but by the specific quality of the decision itself, which was the decision of someone who had understood what the institution was offering, and had concluded that the understanding was sufficient reason to decline. Leopold II had not taken her refusal of Franz Ferdinand with equanimity. He had, in the years of her widowhood, been pressing Stephanie toward the strategic remarriage that the dynastic logic of the period required, and that his own assessment of Stephanie's value on the marriage market, calculated in terms that reflected his established approach to the calculation of value, which was the approach of someone who had built a fortune on the extraction of resources from territories that other people's prior claims could not adequately defend. Stephanie was a resource. Her position as the Dowager Crown Princess of Austria-Hungary was a resource. The resource was depreciating with time, and the depreciation required the resource to be deployed before the depreciation reduced its value to a level that the available market would not pay a premium for. Stephanie was not interested in being deployed. She was also, in the years of the mid-1890s, already developing the alternative to the dynastic deployment that the court and her father were proposing, which was the alternative of the man she had decided she actually wanted, and who was not a Habsburg, and was not a choice that either the Habsburg court or Leopold II would receive with anything other than fury. His name was Elemér Lónyay, and he was everything the court's candidates were not: Hungarian, Protestant, lower ranking, younger than her by less than a year, and genuinely kind. He was also not available yet, in the sense that the relationship had not yet developed to the point where the kindness was something she was planning her future around, rather than simply receiving with the specific gratitude of someone who had not received enough of it. How that relationship developed, what it cost her to pursue it, and what the pursuit eventually produced in the lives of the people who tried to prevent it, is the next part of this account. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Elemér Lónyay denied Lónyay et Vásáros Námény was born on the 26th of November 1863, 6 months before Stephanie, into a family of Hungarian Protestant aristocracy, whose position in the social world of the dual monarchy was the position of people who mattered within their own sphere, and who were understood by the people outside that sphere to matter within it, while not mattering in the terms that the Habsburg court applied to the question of who mattered. His family was ancient, which was the quality the Hungarian aristocracy valued above almost everything else, but its antiquity was the antiquity of the Hungarian nobility rather than the antiquity of the reigning houses of Europe, and the distinction, to the people for whom the distinction organized their understanding of social reality, was the distinction between the people whose rank entitled them to marry into a crown princess's household, and the people whose rank did not. He was, by every account of the people who knew him, in the years when Stephanie first encountered him, a man of the specific formation that a provincial Hungarian aristocracy produces in its best examples, which is the formation of someone educated in the serious European tradition of the period, fluent in the languages that the educated class of the dual monarchy required, possessed of the specific courtesy that people who have been taught that courtesy toward everyone is the only socially defensible position develop, and capable of the quality that Stephanie had been looking for since the wedding night in May 1881, which was the quality of treating the person in front of him as a person rather than as a function. How Stephanie and Elemér first met is not documented with the precision that the subsequent significance of the meeting would seem to warrant, but the available accounts place the introduction in the mid-1890s, in the social world of the Habsburg lands that Stephanie had been navigating in the years of her widowhood, traveling through the empire's territories in the manner that Part 4 of this account described as her preservation mechanism. Hungary was among the territories she visited, and the Hungarian aristocracy's social world was among the social worlds she moved through, and the Hungarian aristocracy's social world was the world in which Elemér Lónyay was one of the figures who appeared at the dinners and the gatherings and the cultural occasions that the Habsburg calendar generated across its eastern territories. He appeared, she was there. The appearing and the being there produced, across the months of their initial contact, the specific development of the kind of feeling that develops between people who find each other interesting and who are in a situation that makes the finding interesting inconvenient enough to make it worth examining carefully before acting on. Stephanie examined it carefully for years. The examination was the examination of someone who had acted on a feeling before, or rather, had had a feeling acted on by other people on her behalf, and who understood the difference between the two processes, and who was not going to allow the external management of the situation to determine its direction this time. She was in her 30s by the time the relationship with Elemér had developed to the point where its direction was becoming clear, and her 30s were the 30s of a woman who had spent her 20s in the specific education that the preceding parts of this account have documented, and who had emerged from that education with the specific clarity about what she wanted. That clarity purchased at that price produces in people who survive the purchase. What she wanted was him. The wanting produced the problem, and the problem had three components that the people in the positions to object to the match deployed with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that they were managing an institution's interest rather than a person's desire. The three components were his religion, his rank, and his age. He was Protestant. The Habsburg court was the most Catholic institution in Europe, and a Protestant husband for the Dowager Crown Princess of Austria-Hungary was not a husband the court's confessional identity could accommodate without acknowledging that the accommodation was a significant departure from the institutional standard it had maintained for centuries. He was lower ranking than any previous candidate for any connection involving Stephanie's position, not merely by the specific measure of the houses from which the court expected its connections to come, but by the general measure of the European social world's understanding of what was appropriate for a woman of her title and her history. And he was younger than her by 6 months, which was not a significant difference by any measurement other than the measurement that the European royal court applied to marriage, which was the measurement that treated a woman older than her husband as an arrangement whose optics were the optics of something that had gone wrong. Leopold II's response to the intelligence that his daughter was developing a personal attachment to a Hungarian Protestant count of lower rank was the response of a man who had spent his reign treating the people in his control as assets to be managed, and who found the management of this particular asset departing from his specifications in a direction he had not authorized. He sent communications. He made the position clear through channels. He summoned Stephanie to conversations whose substance the biographers have reconstructed from the outcomes they produced, rather than from the direct records of what was said, and the outcomes were the outcomes of someone who had received the communications and the position and the conversations and had concluded that the position was not hers to accept. The specific conversations between Stephanie and her father in the years of the late 1890s are not available in a form that provides the dialogue. What is available is the correspondence, in the portions that the biographers have drawn on, and the correspondence has the quality of a sustained argument conducted through writing between two people who have reached irreconcilable positions and who are using the writing to maintain the form of the argument, while the argument itself has already been decided by the person who was not going to change her position. Stephanie's position was settled. She had decided she was going to marry Elemér Lónyay, and the decision had the specific quality of a decision made by someone who understands that the decision will cost her things she values, and who has calculated that the things she values are worth the cost. The emperor's position was more nuanced than Leopold II's, in the specific way that Franz Joseph's positions on the personal matters of the Habsburg women were always more nuanced than the positions of the women's own families, because Franz Joseph had spent 60 years managing a family of several hundred archdukes and archduchesses, whose personal decisions consistently created institutional problems, and he had developed from that experience the specific quality of the pragmatic manager, which was the quality of someone who understood that the prevention of an outcome was only worth pursuing if the alternative to the outcome was achievable, and who had learned to distinguish the achievable alternatives from the ones that were not. The alternative to Stephanie's marriage to Elemér Lónyay was the alternative of her continued widowhood at the Habsburg court, and the continued widowhood of a woman who had already declined the most advantageous available candidate, and who had demonstrated the specific quality of settled determination that the preceding years had demonstrated in her, was not, in Franz Joseph's assessment, an achievable alternative. He permitted the match. The permission was not the permission of someone who found the match ideal. It was the permission of someone who had calculated the costs of the available options and concluded that the permission was the least costly. And the permission came with the specific price that the Habsburg court applied to morganatic connections involving members of its household, which was the price of the titles and the rank and the imperial household membership that had defined Stephanie's position since the day she arrived in Vienna as a 16-year-old Belgian princess in a white dress. She would become, upon her marriage to Elemér, a private person. She would lose the imperial and royal styles. She would lose the court position. She would lose the allowance that the Habsburg household had been providing, though the provision had been managed with the consistent undertone of the charity's contingency that the court applied to women whose institutional usefulness had been exhausted. She would lose everything the institution had given her, which was the specific irony of a price that converted the payment for independence into the receipt of what the institution should have been providing without the payment. She paid it. The wedding was on the 22nd of March 1900 at Miramare Castle near Trieste, the castle that had been built for Archduke Maximilian before he accepted the Mexican crown that would eventually get him shot, and whose specific history of Habsburg ambitions meeting catastrophic ends was perhaps not the symbolism that the occasion required, but was the location that the available logistics and the specific management of a wedding that neither the Belgian court nor the Habsburg court was prepared to celebrate in their respective capitals had produced. It was a private ceremony, attended by the people who were permitted to attend and conducted by the clergy who were willing to officiate over a connection that the Catholic Church could not formally bless, because Elemér was Protestant, and the formal blessing of a Catholic widow's marriage to a Protestant was not something the institutional Church of the Habsburgs was organized to provide. Stephanie wore what the available accounts describe as a dress of considerable simplicity relative to the dress she had worn in the Augustinerkirche in 1881, and the simplicity was the simplicity of an occasion that was about the people in it rather than about the institution around them. There were no 1,000 guests. There were no imperial families assembled from across the continent. There was no court machinery managing the access and the dress and the ceremony and the photographs and the impression. There was Stephanie, who was 35 years old and who was making the choice that the court had told her she could not make, and Elemér, who was 36, and the people who had decided to be present in spite of what the presence cost them in terms of their own relationships with the institutions that disapproved. Leopold II's response to the wedding was the response of a man who had been informed that his asset had disposed of itself without his authorization, and who was going to ensure that the disposal's costs were paid by the asset rather than by the institution. He cut off communication with Stephanie entirely. He forbade her sister Clementine from writing to her, which was the punishment of the form that fathers who control their daughters' access to the family employ when the control of the access is the only leverage remaining after the compliance has been lost. He explored the possibility of stripping her of her titles and her allowance, a possibility that was constrained by the intervention of Franz Joseph, who had his own residual obligation to the woman who had been his daughter-in-law, and who drew the line at Leopold's most punitive instincts. The line was drawn. The titles and the Belgian allowance were not stripped, but the relationship was. Stephanie's daughter Elisabeth Marie was not at the wedding. She was 17 years old, and she was living at the Habsburg court under the emperor's protection, and the relationship between the protection and Stephanie's remarriage was not the relationship of coincidence. Elizabeth had been raised by the court since Mayerling, in the specific manner of the children of houses that have decided the child's institutional formation requires the institutional environment rather than the maternal one, and the raising had produced a young woman whose relationship to her mother was the relationship of someone who had been formed by the people who had decided her mother was to blame for everything and who had absorbed the formation's conclusions. Elizabeth Marie did not attend her mother's wedding. The mother and daughter would not have a close relationship for the remainder of either of their lives, and the specific reasons for that distance are the subject of a later part of this account. What Stephanie had at the conclusion of the 22nd of March 1900 was this: a husband of her own choosing, a castle in Hungary where they would live, the private life that the preceding 19 years had been organized to deny her, and the specific freedom of someone who has paid the institutional price and collected what the price purchased. She had also a father who would not speak to her, a family who had largely cut the connection, a daughter who was not present, a court that had discharged her, and a world that understood her second marriage as the proof of everything it had always suspected about her, which was that she was the kind of woman who put her own desires above the obligations of her position. She was. The putting of her own desires above the obligations of her position was the thing the institution had spent 19 years trying to prevent, and that she had spent 19 years working toward, and the working toward it had cost what it had cost, and had produced what it had produced, which was the life she was going to live, rather than the life she had been assigned. The life she had been assigned had been the life of the empress she was told she was going to be. The title of her memoirs, published 35 years later, was Je devais être impératrice. I was to be empress. The past tense is the whole of the memoir's argument. She was to be. The being was not what happened. What happened instead is what the following parts of this account examine in the terms that the following 39 years produced. 2 years after the wedding at Miramar, Stephanie's mother died. Queen Marie Henriette of Belgium, the Austrian Archduchess who had spent her marriage to Leopold II in the specific condition of managed misery that the preceding parts of this account established as the domestic environment of Stephanie's formation, died on the 19th of September 1902 at the Spa Resort in Belgium, where she had been living separately from her husband in the specific arrangement of a royal couple who had agreed, tacitly and through the management of their social calendars, that the arrangement was preferable to the alternative of continued proximity. She had spent the last years of her life in reasonable peace, which was the peace of someone who had outlasted the requirements of the role that had organized her misery and who was managing the remainder with the specific quiet that follows the exhaustion of the obligations one was formed to fulfill. Stephanie learned of her mother's death and traveled to Brussels for the funeral. The journey was the journey of a daughter who had not been close to her mother in the way that the word close normally describes closeness, because the household in which their relationship had developed was not the household that closeness in the ordinary sense required, but who understood that the death of a mother is the death of the first relationship, and that the first relationship's ending requires the specific acknowledgement of presence, regardless of what the relationship contained. She made the journey. She arrived at the palace. She passed through the rooms that the funeral's management had organized for the family's use and the family's grief, and she reached the chapel where her mother's coffin lay, and she moved toward the coffin with the intention of paying the respect that a daughter pays at her mother's death. Her father had her removed from the chapel. Leopold II, who was present at his own wife's funeral in the capacity of the bereaved sovereign whose mourning the occasion required him to perform, had given instructions. The instructions were the instructions of a man who had decided that Stephanie's attendance at the chapel was an attendance he was not prepared to permit, and who had arranged for the implementation of the decision in advance, so that the implementation would not require the specific public scene of a father physically confronting his daughter, which would have created the kind of coverage that Leopold managed his affairs to avoid. The implementation was conducted through the servants and the household officials, whose function included the management of access, and the management of access produced the specific outcome of Stephanie being redirected from the chapel before she reached the coffin, in the presence of enough witnesses to establish what had happened without the witnesses being in a position to prevent it. She was not permitted to say goodbye to her mother's body. The account of the event is the account that Stephanie preserved in her memoirs, and that the biographers who examined the Belgian royal family's management of its daughters have documented from multiple angles. It has a specific quality that the other episodes of her life, even the worst ones, do not quite reproduce, which is the quality of the arbitrary and the petty operating at the maximum possible personal cost. Leopold II had spent his reign conducting atrocities on the other side of the world, burning villages and cutting off hands, and presiding over the deaths of millions in the service of his private commercial enterprise in the Belgian Congo. The removal of a daughter from her mother's coffin was not an atrocity in that register. It was the domestic expression of the same mind, the mind that organized the world around its own authority, and that exercised the authority in whatever direction the moment made available, without the specific human recognition of the person in the path of the exercise. Stephanie had known this about her father since childhood. The knowledge had organized her understanding of the formation she had received, and had contributed to the specific quality of resilience that the preceding parts of this account have traced through the marriage, and the widowhood, and the refusal of Franz Ferdinand, and the determination to marry Elemér. She knew who her father was. The chapel episode confirmed the knowledge in the most intimate available form, which is the form of a man applying his authority to the specific grief of a daughter at her mother's coffin. And the application was the final piece of the education that Leopold II provided his daughters, which was the education in what the authority of men who regard people as instruments looks like when it operates at the level of the completely personal. She left Brussels. She returned to Rusovce. She did not see her father again in circumstances that the record describes as anything other than the managed distance of two people who have reached the end of whatever the relationship was, and who are conducting its remainder through the intermediaries of public occasion and legal correspondence. The legal correspondence was the correspondence of the Congo inheritance lawsuit, and the lawsuit is the dimension of Stephanie's relationship to her father's legacy that the romantic account of her life has most consistently reduced to a footnote, because the lawsuit is not a romantic element, and the romantic account requires the non-romantic elements to remain peripheral. But the lawsuit is not a footnote. It is the document of a woman who had decided that the specific instrument of the men who had managed her life was an instrument she was now capable of using herself, and the using of it was the using of the law in the direction of what the law said she was owed, rather than in the direction of what the institution had decided she should receive. Leopold II died on the 17th of December 1909, at the age of 74, having spent the last years of his reign watching the Congo Free State's management practices become the subject of international investigation and eventually international condemnation, and having responded to the investigation with the specific quality of the man who believes that his private property is his private concern and that other people's assessment of how he manages it is an impertinence rather than a reckoning. The Congo had been transferred to the Belgian state in 1908, under the pressure of the international campaign that Roger Casement and Edmond Denis Morel had organized, and that the testimony of the Congo's surviving population had made impossible to dismiss, and the transfer had converted the private fortune that the Congo had generated into the legacy that Leopold's heirs would contest. Stephanie and her older sister Louise had been systematically disadvantaged in the management of their father's estate. The specifics of the disadvantage were the specifics of a man who had spent decades organizing his financial affairs in the direction of outcomes that served his immediate interests rather than the legal obligations he bore to the people whose claims his financial arrangements were designed to diminish. And the people whose claims were being diminished included his daughters, whose inheritance rights the arrangements had addressed with the specific thoroughness of someone who had decided that the arrangements were his to make and the rights were his to manage. Stephanie and Louise brought their claims to the Belgian courts. The courts examined the claims with the specific difficulty of courts examining financial arrangements of considerable complexity that have been organized by someone with the resources to make the complexity a feature of the defense, and the examination produced, across the years of the litigation, the outcome that the complexity had been organized to produce, which was the outcome in which the inheritance that the daughters claimed they had been owed was found to have been legally arranged in directions that the courts determined they could not reverse. The sisters lost. The fortune that the Congo had generated, accumulated across 4 decades of the most profitable colonial exploitation the 19th century had produced, passed to the people and institutions that Leopold had directed it toward, and the daughters who had been traded in the marriage market of the European dynasties in the service of their father's ambitions received from those ambitions the specific return of nothing. The lawsuit's failure joined the chapel episode and the Clementine prohibition and the title loss and the 20-year estrangement as the inventory of what Stephanie's relationship with her father had actually been, assembled across the years of the legal proceedings and the available correspondence, and the memoirs accounting of the relationship in the terms that 30 years of distance from it had produced. The accounting was not the accounting of a woman who had devoted herself to hatred of the man who had managed her so badly, because hatred is an energy that requires the management of its own expenditure, and Stephanie had found better uses for the energy. It was the accounting of someone who had looked at the record and arrived at the specific conclusion that the record warranted, which was that the record documented a father who had regarded her as an instrument and had used her as one, and that the using had produced the outcomes the using had produced, and that the remaining question was what to do with the outcomes rather than what to feel about the using. What she had been doing with the outcomes since the wedding at Miramer in 1900 was living the life at Rusovce that the outcomes had made possible. The castle was not the Hofburg, it was not the Imperial Hunting Lodge or the Summer Palace or any of the buildings in which the preceding years of Stephanie's life had been staged. It was a Hungarian country house of the type that the Magyar nobility inhabited, organized around the specific domestic rhythm of the agricultural estate and the social calendar of the local aristocracy, and the particular pleasures of the people who had decided that the pleasures available in a Hungarian country house were sufficient for a life conducted with the specific intention of sufficiency. Elemér was there. That was the primary fact of the castle's character, and the primary fact organized everything else, because the presence of a person who had chosen to be there and who was treating the people around him as people rather than as functions was the primary transformation from every preceding domestic environment Stephanie had inhabited. The specific quality of Elemér's presence in the marriage, documented in the accounts of people who observed them together across the years of the Rusovce life, was the quality that this account has been reaching toward since the moment of his introduction in Part 5, which is the quality of the person who is simply good at being in a relationship with another person. He was kind in the daily sense that daily kindness requires, which is not the kindness of the grand gesture, but the kindness of the consistent attention to what the other person actually needs, rather than what the occasion requires the attender to provide. He listened to her. The listening produced in Stephanie the specific response that listening produces in someone who has spent 35 years in environments that were not organized around what she had to say, which was the response of a woman who was, gradually and imperfectly, and in the specific way that gradual and imperfect processes work, learning what it felt like to be in a room with someone who wanted her there for reasons that were her own, rather than reasons that were the dynasty's. She painted. The painting had been the occupation she had found in the traveling years of her widowhood, and it continued at Rusovce as the specific creative practice of someone who has identified in the production of visual work the particular form of absorption that the other available activities do not provide. She read, extensively, in the multiple languages that her formation had supplied and that the years of traveling had maintained, and the reading produced the engagement with ideas that the Viennese court life had rarely permitted, because the Viennese court life was not organized around the engagement with ideas, but around the performance of the social forms that the engagement with ideas was often in tension with. She managed the estate in the specific sense of the active engagement with the practical management of an agricultural property that a woman who has spent 20 years managing nothing independently finds both useful and satisfying, because the management produces results that are visible and accessible and that belong to the person doing the managing rather than to the institution deploying her. The happiness was the specific happiness of someone who had arrived at it through the specific route of someone who had not had it and who understood, from the not having, what having it actually required. It was not the happiness of someone who did not know what unhappiness was, because she knew in the most intimate available terms. It was the happiness of someone who had decided that the knowing was the reason to value the having rather than the reason to doubt it, and who was valuing it daily in the specific ways that daily valuing takes, which are the ways that do not make good legend, but that make good lives. The legend of Stephanie's life had always been organized around the Mayerling legend, and the Mayerling legend required her to be a figure whose significance was retrospective, whose presence in the story was the presence of the wife who failed and the widow who survived. The Rusovce years were the years that the Mayerling legend had no narrative use for, because they were the years in which the widow who had survived was simply living, and living is the narrative that the legend cannot organize itself around, because the legend requires drama rather than duration, and duration, when it is inhabited by the right person in the right circumstances, does not generate the specific kind of drama that legends are built from. She was building something else. The something else was a life, and the life was hers, and the next 30 years would demonstrate what the life she had built was capable of sustaining, which turned out to be rather more than the dynasty that had assigned her a different one had anticipated. Archduchess Elizabeth Marie of Austria was 6 years old when her father died at Mayerling, and the specific circumstances of his death produced in the Habsburg court the specific institutional response that the court applied to children whose parents had created problems. The child was absorbed into the institutional environment, managed by the institution's formation mechanisms, and shaped into the person that the institution required, rather than the person that the child's own nature might have produced without the institutional management. The management was not malicious in the way that malicious management is malicious. It was the management of an institution that had no other available framework, because the institution's framework was the only framework it possessed, and applying the framework to a 6-year-old girl who had lost her father in the most dramatic circumstances the Habsburg court had produced in living memory, was what the institution did with the materials it had. Elizabeth Marie, known within the family as Ersi, grew up in the Hofburg under the emperor's protection, in the households of the Habsburg women who were assigned her care, in the specific environment of the court that had decided her mother was to blame for her father's death, and that communicated this conclusion to the child through the ambient social atmosphere of the imperial household, in the way that ambient social atmospheres communicate their contents to the children who grow up inside them. She did not grow up understanding her mother as the woman who had been 16 when she arrived in Vienna, who had been infected by her father, who had been refused permission to go home, who had watched Artur Potocki die within a year of Mayerling. She grew up understanding her mother as the woman the court had characterized, the one who had failed. The characterization was not delivered to Erzi in the form of explicit statements. It was delivered through the specific social mechanisms that courts employ for this kind of transmission, which are the mechanisms of the managed encounter, the supervised visit, the carefully arranged occasion at which the child observes her mother in the institutional context, rather than the private one, and the institutional context is the context in which the mother's failure is most legible, because the institutional context was the context the mother had failed in. Stephanie visited her daughter in Vienna in the years of her widowhood, and the visits were the visits of someone who was present in an environment organized around her absence, present in rooms managed by people who had decided the verdict, present with a child who was absorbing the verdict from the management of the rooms. The visits produced what visits conducted in those conditions produce, which was contact without the depth of contact that the contact was supposed to generate. The Habsburg formation gave Ergi the Habsburg formation's standard products, the social competence required of an archduchess, the capacity for the public performance of composure, the education appropriate to her rank. It gave her also the specific difficulty that the Habsburg formation produced in the people who received it most comprehensively, which was the difficulty of the private life, the relationship between the institutional self and the personal one. The specific problem of a person who has been formed entirely around institutional requirements, finding a way to inhabit the non-institutional dimensions of existence. The problem was the problem that Rudolf had not solved, that Stephanie had spent 19 years solving at enormous cost, and that Erzi would spend her adult life engaged with in ways that her mother could not endorse, and would eventually respond to by removing Erzi from her will. The first marriage was the marriage that the court arranged, rather than the marriage that Erzi wanted, and the arrangement was the arrangement of people who had decided that the daughter of the dead crown prince required a match that stabilized her institutional position, rather than one that reflected her personal inclinations. Prince Otto of Windisch-Graetz was from a family of sufficient Habsburg-adjacent standing to make the match institutionally acceptable, and he was available, and the availability and the acceptability were the criteria that the arrangement required to be met. The marriage took place in 1902, when Erzi was 19, and it produced 4 children and a divorce, which was the specific outcome that marriages contracted on the basis of availability and acceptability rather than compatibility, tend toward when the parties involved are people with sufficient personal will to eventually act on the incompatibility. The divorce was the Habsburg court's second heresy problem, and it was a larger problem than the first, because the divorce required the court to manage the fact that the granddaughter of the emperor, the daughter of the dead crown prince whose memory organized the Mayerling legend, had contracted and dissolved a marriage in ways that the dynasty's Catholic identity found uncomfortable, and that the social world of the remaining Habsburg establishment found additionally complicated by who Erzsi had decided to spend the subsequent portion of her life with. Leopold Petzneck was a socialist politician. He was a member of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, the party that had organized the working class of the Austrian Republic in the years following the empire's collapse, and whose political program was the program that the Habsburg dynasty and the Habsburg nobility and everyone associated with either would have characterized, with varying degrees of passion, as the program of the people who intended to liquidate everything the dynasty had built. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew them together, the person who made Erzsi happy, in the specific way that the right person makes the right person happy, which is to say genuinely and durably, and without the performance of happiness that the Habsburg formation had produced in the people it formed, who were performing it, rather than experiencing it. Stephanie's response to Erzsi's relationship with Petzneck was the response of a woman whose own life had been organized around the specific right to choose the person she wanted to spend it with, and who had paid an enormous price for the exercise of that right, and who found in her daughter's exercise of the same right a problem that the payment should have purchased the understanding to avoid. The response was not the response of understanding, it was the response of disapproval, expressed first in the private correspondence, and then in the managed distance of a relationship that had already been organized around distance, and that the Petzneck situation pushed to the specific threshold of estrangement. Stephanie disapproved of the divorce. She disapproved of Petzneck. She disapproved of the socialist politics, which was not an incidental disapproval on the part of someone who had spent 40 years in the world of European royalty, and who understood the socialist politics as the politics of the people who were dismantling the world she had been formed in, however unhappy the formation had made her. She disapproved of the manner in which Erzsi was conducting herself, which was the manner of someone who had decided that the institutional requirements of her position were less important than the requirements of her own happiness, and who was acting on the decision in ways that the institutional world could not accommodate. The specific irony of this disapproval does not require extensive elaboration, because the irony makes itself. Stephanie had spent 19 years after Mayerling making precisely the same decision that Erzsi was now making, had paid the price of Belgian family estrangement and title loss and Leopold II at the chapel, and had arrived at the conclusion that the price had been worth paying. She was now declining to extend to her daughter the understanding that the people who had refused to extend it to her had been wrong to refuse. The refusal was not the refusal of a hypocrite in the simple sense, because the situations were not identical, and the differences were the differences that Stephanie's assessment of them produced. She had chosen Elemér, who was a Hungarian Protestant count of lower rank, but who was not a socialist politician. The distinction mattered to her in the specific way that distinctions matter to people whose formation has given them frameworks within which certain variations are thinkable and others are not, and the Petzneck variation was outside the framework in ways that the Elemér variation, whatever the court had said about it, had not been. But the irony stands regardless of the distinctions, because the core of what Stephanie disapproved of in Erzsi was the core of what Leopold II and the Habsburg court had disapproved of in her, which was the decision to place personal happiness above institutional obligation, and the placement of Stephanie in the position of the institutional authority, disapproving of the personal decision, was the placement that the formation had always been moving toward producing in her, and that she had spent 20 years at Rusovce, believing she had escaped. The last contact between Stephanie and Erzsi was in 1925. The year is the year that the biographers identify as the point at which the managed distance became unmanaged absence, and the absence was maintained across the remaining 20 years of Stephanie's life, without a recorded resumption of the relationship. The specific occasion or exchange that produced the 1925 terminus is not documented in the available sources in the form of a definitive account, which means the terminus is the terminus without the clearly documented event that precipitated it, and the absence of the precipitating event in the record is itself a piece of evidence. Because the most painful endings are often the endings that do not have a single dramatic moment, but that accumulate into the quiet irreversibility of two people who have decided that continuing is not something either of them has the resources to manage. Stephanie published her memoirs in 1935, 10 years after the last contact with her daughter, under the title that Part 6 of this account introduced, and that she had been holding as the organizing frame of her life's meaning since at least the years of her widowhood. The memoirs were the document of a woman who had decided that the account she had carried privately across the 50 years of its accumulation was an account that the world should have, and who had written it with the combination of candor and the specific selection of candor that memoir always requires, which is the selection of the things the memoirist has decided can now be said, and the retention of the things the memoirist has decided remain private. Says, what she decided could be said was substantial: the brutality of the wedding night, the syphilis's consequences, the court's blame, the Emperor Franz Joseph's cold management, the Empress Elizabeth's sustained hostility, the chapel, the lawsuit, the life at Rusovce. What she retained in the private register was the private register's contents, and the private register's contents are what the available sources around the memoir have been providing as the complement to the memoir's own account. In 1944, Stephanie disinherited her daughter. The disinheritance was the act of a woman of 80 who had not seen her daughter in 19 years, and who had decided that the 19 years and what they represented constituted a sufficient answer to the question of what Erzsi would receive from the estate that Stephanie and Elemér had managed together at Rusovce across the preceding 4 decades. The disinheritance was also the act of a woman who was aware that the world was ending around her in a form she had not anticipated when she had fled the Habsburg court in 1900, because the world was ending in the form of the Second World War, which was the war that the assassination of the man she had refused to marry had initiated, and that had now returned in its second iteration with a thoroughness that suggested the first had not been sufficient to produce the lesson its destruction was intended to teach. The specific content of Erzsi's life in 1944, which was the content that the disinheritance was responding to, was the content of a woman who had been living with Leopold Petzneck since the 1920s, and who had eventually married him, and who was managing the specific conditions of life in wartime Austria with the resources that her choices had left her. The conditions were difficult. The disinheritance made them more difficult. Stephanie's decision to disinherit her daughter was the decision that the available sources document without providing the interior account that would make it fully comprehensible, because the interior account was the interior account of a woman of 80 whose relationship to her daughter had been organized around distance for 19 years, and who was making the final available institutional decision in the direction of the distance. Erzsi outlived her mother by 18 years, dying in 1963 at the age of 80, and spent the years following Stephanie's death in the specific circumstances of a woman who had been formed by a dynasty that no longer existed, in a country that had been reorganized by the war and its aftermath into a political system that the formation had not equipped her to inhabit. She and Petzneck lived quietly, and she died quietly, and the Habsburg formation that had organized her childhood had been in the ground since 1918, and what survived of it survived in the memories of the people who had been formed by it, and who were spending the remaining years of their lives explaining to the world what the formation had been, and what the formation had done to the people it formed. Stephanie had been one of those people. She had explained it in the memoirs, in the terms that the available candor permitted. What remained unexplained, in the specifically non-diplomatic sense of the private account that the memoir had decided to retain, was the interior of the Erzsi relationship, the specific content of the distance that had organized the final 20 years of their connection. It remained unexplained because the record that would have explained it had not survived in the form that would make the explanation available, and the form that the explanation was not available in was the form of two women's private understanding of each other, conducted across the decades of their shared and separate experience of the institution that had formed them both, and that had failed them in different ways, and that they had responded to in ways sufficiently similar to produce the irony that the irony required, and sufficiently different to produce the estrangement that the estrangement required. Both things were true simultaneously. Both women had chosen personal happiness over institutional obligation. Both had paid the institutional price, and neither had extended to the other the specific recognition that the payment was the same payment, made in different currencies, for the same fundamental right. On the 28th of June 1914, Stephanie was 50 years old and living at Rusovce, and the news that reached her that afternoon from Sarajevo was the news of the death of a man she had declined to marry 24 years earlier. She did not record her reaction in any form that has reached the public archive, which is the specific quality of restraint that she had maintained across the preceding 24 years of a marriage she had not taken to the press, and a private life she had not converted into a public account. What the record contains instead is what the record always contains when the private response is withheld, which is the public consequence. And the public consequence of the afternoon of the 28th of June 1914 was the consequence that the summer of 1914 unfolded from with the specific inevitability of a mechanism whose parts had been assembled across the preceding decades, and that required only the initiating event to begin its operation. The mechanism was the mechanism of the alliance system that European diplomacy had been building since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and the initiating event was the 2 shots that Gavrilo Princip fired into the open car on the Franz Josef Street in Sarajevo, and the operation of the mechanism produced, across the 5 weeks between June 28 and August 4, the declarations of war that converted the assassination of one archduke into the first engagement of the war that would kill 9 million soldiers and redraw the map of the continent in ways that no one who had been alive in June 1914 had imagined as the possible consequence of a single afternoon in Bosnia. Stephanie watched the war from Rusovce in the manner of someone who was outside the institutions whose conflict was producing it, and who was therefore watching rather than participating, though the watching, at Rusovce, in the years of the war, was not the detached watching of someone whose life was unaffected by the events being watched. Hungary was the kingdom whose eastern half the castle stood in. The men of the Hungarian aristocracy, whose social world she and Elemér inhabited, were the men who went to the war. The estates that the agricultural economy of the region depended on were the estates that the war was depleting of the labor that sustained them. The supplies that the domestic life of the castle required were the supplies that the wartime economy was diverting toward the front. The war was everywhere, in the way that wars are everywhere when they are continental rather than colonial, when they are happening to the people of the country rather than to the people of someone else's country, which was the only form of war that Leopold II's Belgium had conducted in Stephanie's formation, and that had therefore not prepared her for the specific texture of a war conducted on the home continent. Franz Josef died on the 21st of November 1916, at the age of 86, after 68 years on the throne of an empire that had been contracting and reforming and managing its own complexity across the entirety of his reign, and that was now contracting toward its final configuration under the pressure of a war that the empire had begun and that the empire was not going to survive. He died in the middle of it, which spared him the specific experience of watching the institutional structure he had spent 68 years managing dissolve, though the dissolving had been underway for long enough before his death that the sparing was partial rather than complete. His successor was his great-nephew Karl I, the son of the Archduke Otto, who was Franz Ferdinand's younger brother, and Karl's accession was the accession of a 29-year-old man to the most complicated throne in Europe in the worst possible year of the most destructive war in European history. Stephanie had known Franz Josef for 35 years, from the day she arrived in Vienna as a 16-year-old Belgian princess to the last encounters of her widowhood, years before Miramer. The relationship had been the relationship of a woman and the man who controlled her life's conditions, managed by both parties with the specific quality of the formal and the constrained that the relationship's institutional nature imposed. He had refused her permission to go home after Mayerling. He had declined to act on her warning about Rudolf's state of mind. He had permitted her marriage to Elemér when Leopold II would have prevented it, which was the one act of his management of her situation that the record shows landing on the side of her interest rather than the institutions. She had not forgiven him for the rest, which was the specific account of her feelings that the private correspondence indicates, though forgiveness is perhaps not the right word for what a woman feels toward a man who controlled the conditions of 20 years of her life, and who exercised the control in the direction of the institution's requirements, rather than hers. What she felt was the feeling that precedes forgiveness, which is the feeling of accurate assessment. And the accurate assessment was the assessment of someone who had understood clearly what had been done and why and in whose interest, and who was living with that understanding rather than resolving it. Karl I lasted 2 years. The war ended on the 11th of November 1918, and on the 11th of November 1918, Karl I signed the document that removed him from the governance of Austria, and 2 days later signed the document that removed him from the governance of Hungary. And the signing of the two documents was the ending of the Habsburg dynasty's continuous rule over Central Europe, an ending that had been coming for long enough that the surprise was not that it happened, but that the documents were signed so cleanly, without the specific violence that the endings of dynasties had historically required. Karl went into exile, to Switzerland, to Madeira, where he died in 1922, at the age of 34, the last emperor of Austria, buried in a Portuguese island that had been entirely outside the geography of his empire. Stephanie was 54 years old when the empire ended, and the ending of the empire was the ending of the world in which she had been formed, which was not the same as the ending of her world, because she had spent the 18 years since Miramare systematically removing herself from the world in which she had been formed and constructing at Rusovce the alternative world that the formation had not provided. The alternative world survived the empire's ending in the specific way that private lives survive the collapse of the institutions that organized the public world around them, which is that they continue, because private lives do not depend on the institutional infrastructure that public lives require, and that institutional collapses remove. Rusovce was still there, Elemér was still there. The castle and the estate and the domestic rhythm that they had built across 18 years were the structures of a life that did not require the Habsburg court to be functioning in order to continue functioning, and they continued. What the empire's ending removed from the geography of Stephanie's life was not the life itself, but the context that had given the life's meaning its specific shape, which was the context of the institution she had been formed by and against. The institution had been the thing she had been refusing for 35 years, from the moment she declined to perform the widowhood the court had assigned her, through the declinatures that followed, and the institution's disappearance removed from the refusing the thing that the refusing was directed at. She had spent 35 years being the woman who had chosen differently from what the Habsburg court required. After 1918, there was no Habsburg court to have chosen differently from, and the choosing differently became simply the life rather than the choice, which is a different thing. And the difference produced in Stephanie's sense of herself the specific adjustment of someone whose identity has been organized around a resistance that no longer has its object. The Treaty of Trianon in June 1920 addressed the adjustment's geographical dimension with the thoroughness of a peace settlement determined to resolve the questions that the war had raised through the most comprehensive available redrawing of the map. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory and 1/3 of its ethnic Hungarian population to the newly constituted states around it, and Rusovce, which had been a Hungarian estate inside the Kingdom of Hungary, inside the Habsburg dual monarchy, became a Slovak estate inside the newly constituted Czechoslovakia, and the estate's relationship to the political entity that now surrounded it was the relationship of an anomaly, a piece of the old world sitting inside the new one, maintained by the people who had been living in it since before the new world existed, and who were managing the specific administrative novelty of being subjects of a country that had not existed when they built the life they were living in it. The administrative novelty was managed. The practical management of a large agricultural estate is not, primarily, a political activity, and the people who managed the practical management of Rusovce in the years following Trianon managed it with the specific continuity of people who understood that the wheat grew regardless of the flag flying over the customs post, and who were not going to allow the flag's change to interrupt the wheat's growing. Stephanie and Elemér were in their mid-50s, which was the age at which the people who have built a domestic life have built it sufficiently that the building's interruption requires a more substantial force than a changed border to produce. The estate continued. The life continued. The calendar of seasons and harvests and maintenance and the social world of the local aristocracy, now a social world inside a different political entity than the one it had organized itself around, continued in the modified form that continuity in changed conditions always takes. The decade of the 1920s was the decade in which the life at Rusovce produced the specific quality that Stephanie's memoir would later describe in terms that the memoir's readers found among the most human in a document that had earned its humanity across the preceding 400 pages of institutional management and personal catastrophe. She described, in the passages that cover the Rusovce years, something that she had not had the vocabulary for in the years when she was living inside the institutions that had organized her formation, which was the vocabulary of the ordinary day, the ordinary conversation, the ordinary pleasure of the estate's specific beauties, the Danube visible from certain windows, the gardens that the years had grown into the gardens they were going to be, the specific quality of light at certain hours, in certain seasons, that people who live in a place for decades learn to anticipate with the pleasure of the anticipated, rather than the surprise of the new. She was writing about the ordinary, with the specific appreciation of someone who had spent the first half of her life in environments where the ordinary had been systematically excluded by the institutional management of every available hour, and who understood what the ordinary was worth in the specific terms of having been denied it for decades. The understanding was not the understanding of someone who had arrived at the ordinary through boredom or through the absence of the alternative. It was the understanding of someone who had paid for it and who knew the price and who found the price, from the vantage point of the decades at Rusovce, worth what it had cost. The last decade before the Second War arrived with the specific quality that the last decades of stable periods always arrive with in retrospect, which is the quality of something that is sustaining itself through the growing evidence that the sustaining will not be indefinitely possible, and that the people inside the stable period are not looking at the evidence with the attention it will later appear to have deserved. Europe in the 1930s was the Europe of the evidence accumulating in the specific direction that the decade would confirm, and the evidence was accumulating in the direction of the Germany that was reorganizing itself under the leadership of a man whose political program was the program of the people who had decided that the Treaty of Versailles and everything it had produced was a settlement to be undone rather than a peace to be sustained. Stephanie published her memoirs in 1935, at the age of 71, in the specific year when the evidence was sufficiently advanced to be legible as direction rather than merely as incident, and the publication was the act of a woman who had decided that the account she had been carrying for 50 years was an account that the world should receive before the world's next reorganization made the receiving of it more complicated. The memoirs were received with the interest that memoirs of people who have been present at historically significant events always receive, and with the specific additional interest of a woman who had been present at Mayerling, or rather adjacent to it, and who was describing the adjacent position with the candor that 50 years of distance from the position had made available. The world's next reorganization came in September 1939, and what it did to the life at Rusovce, and what the life at Rusovce did in response to it, is the next part of this account. In the autumn of 1939, Stephanie was 75 years old, and had been living at Rusovce for 39 years, and the announcement of the German invasion of Poland produced in her the specific response of someone who had been watching the evidence accumulate across the preceding decade, and who understood what the announcement meant in terms of what was coming, rather than in terms of what had just happened. What had just happened was the invasion of Poland. What was coming was the reconfiguration of Central Europe for the second time in her adult life, and the reconfiguration would arrive at Rusovce in the form of the political and military realities that the reconfiguration produced, in the same way that the first reconfiguration had arrived at Rusovce in the form of the Treaty of Trianon and the changed border and the administrative novelty of being subjects of Czechoslovakia. The second reconfiguration was different from the first, in the specific way that the Second World War was different from the first, which was the difference between a war that reorganized the political map and a war that reorganized the moral one. The First War had ended the Habsburg Empire, and the German Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, and had produced, in their place, the nation-states that the 19th century's nationalist movements had been building toward, and that the 20th century's peace settlement had attempted to formalize. The Second War had been initiated by one of those nation-states in the direction of reversing the settlement that had produced it, and the reversing was being accomplished by methods whose moral character the decade of the 1930s had been establishing with increasing clarity, and that the invasion of Poland confirmed in the terms that confirmation of long-established patterns always confirms, which was the terms of the thing finally doing what the evidence had been indicating it was going to do. Hungary's relationship to the Second World War was the relationship of a country whose political leadership had decided that alignment with Germany was the alignment that served the national interest, which was the interest of recovering the territories lost at Trianon, and that had pursued that alignment through the political mechanisms of the 1930s and into the war itself. Hungary entered the war in June 1941 on the German side, which meant that Rusovce, the Slovak estate of a Hungarian aristocratic couple who had been living in it since 1900, was now inside a political and military reality organized around the German alliance. And the implications of that reality for the specific circumstances of two people in their late 70s managing a large estate were the implications of a context that neither of them had designed, and that neither of them could adequately manage at the scale that the context required. Elemér was 75 in 1939 and 78 in 1942, which were the ages at which the management of a large estate in a country at war produces the specific variety of physical and logistical difficulty that age and war together generate in people who are trying to maintain the private life they built in peacetime against the demands that the wartime environment makes on the resources of that life. The estate's management required the labor of people who were being mobilized. The estate's resources were being directed by the wartime economy toward uses the wartime economy had determined were more urgent than the maintenance of an aristocratic household in Slovakia. The specific pleasures of Rusovce, the gardens and the Danube light and the ordinary day, that Stephanie had described in her memoirs with the appreciation of someone who had spent 35 years valuing the ordinary, were being eroded by the conditions that war imposes on the ordinary, when the ordinary exists inside the war's geography. The disinheritance of Erzsébet in 1944 was made in this context, and the context matters for understanding the decision in a way that examining the decision in isolation does not permit. Stephanie was 80 years old in 1944. She was living in wartime Slovakia, in a castle she was not certain she would be able to remain in. She was watching the war produce its second reorganization of the world around her, and she was making the legal decisions about her estate that the situation required to be made before the situation made the making of them impossible, because the advancing of the war was advancing toward the specific configuration that the spring of 1945 would confirm, and the confirmation would confirm it faster than anyone who was not watching with the specific attention of a military strategist could have anticipated. The disinheritance document is the document of a woman in the specific circumstances of 1944, aged, isolated from her daughter by 19 years of distance, managing the deterioration of a world she had built and that the war was threatening, and making the final available legal decision in the direction of the distance. The document's content, establishing that Erzsébet would not inherit from Stephanie's estate, was the content of a decision that the 19 years of the 1925 terminus and Erzsébet's life with Leopold Petznek and the specific quality of the relationship's ending had produced, and the wartime context was the context in which the decision was formalized rather than the context in which the decision was made, because the decision had been accumulating since at least the late 1920s and had been a settled conclusion for long enough that the 1944 document was the formalization of something already determined rather than the making of a new determination. What the spring of 1945 brought to the geography of Rusovce was what the spring of 1945 brought to the geography of everything east of the Elbe that the German alliance had been defending and that the German alliance could no longer defend, which was the Red Army. The Soviet advance through Hungary and Slovakia in the winter and spring of 1944 to 1945 was the advance that the German military had been attempting to contain since the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 had established the direction of the war's outcome, and the containing had been consuming the territory between Moscow and the Danube at the rate that a failing defense consumes territory, which is rapidly enough to be alarming and slowly enough to preserve, for the people in the territory being consumed, the specific illusion that the consuming might yet be stopped before it reaches them. The illusion did not preserve itself past April 1945. The Soviet forces that reached the Rusovce region in April of that year reached it with the specific quality of armies at the end of a long advance through hostile territory, which is a quality that the people whose territory is being advanced through understand without the advancing army being required to explain it. Stephanie and Elemér understood it. They had been watching the advance on the available maps and through the available news, and they had understood for long enough that the understanding was not a surprise when the advance arrived at the specific proximity that required a decision. The decision was the decision that people who are 81 and living in a castle in the path of an advancing army make when the advancing army's arrival is a matter of days rather than weeks, which was the decision to leave. They left the castle at Rusovce, the castle they had lived in for 45 years, the castle where the 45 years of the life they had built together had been built, without the time or the capacity that 45 years of accumulated domestic life would normally require for its orderly departure. The specific contents of what they took and what they left are not documented in the available sources with the completeness that the departure's significance warrants, because the departure was a wartime departure, and wartime departures are not conducted with the archival thoroughness that peacetime relocations can achieve. What the sources document is the destination and the manner of reaching it, which was the Benedictine Archabbey of Pannonhalma in Hungary, a medieval monastery in the hills of western Hungary, whose antiquity and whose religious character had given it a specific status in the wartime management of refugees and fugitives from the advancing front, a status that the Benedictine community of Pannonhalma had been exercising since the previous year in the form of providing shelter to people for whom shelter had become the primary available need. Pannonhalma was founded in 996. It is among the oldest continuously inhabited buildings in the world that human hands have maintained in recognizable form across 1,000 years of the specific entropy that time and conflict apply to human constructions. The monastery stands on a hill above the Győr basin, visible from a considerable distance, and the visibility had organized its history as a landmark in the specific way that prominent religious buildings organize their histories, which was as the building that people moved toward when they needed the combination of protection and orientation that such buildings have always provided to the people in their vicinity. Stephanie and Elemér moved toward it in April 1945, in the specific circumstances of two people in their 80s who had left their home under the pressure of an advancing army and who needed the combination that Pannonhalma had been providing. The Benedictine community received them. The receiving was the receiving of an institution organized around hospitality, in the specific tradition of the Benedictine rule that Benedict had formulated in the 6th century and that had organized Benedictine communities since, and the hospitality was extended to the people the community was receiving, without the specific assessment of whether the people receiving it were the people that an institution organized around other values might have decided were most deserving of it. Stephanie was the former crown princess of Austria-Hungary. She was also an 81-year-old woman who needed shelter, and the need was the criterion that the Benedictine rule organized the community's response around. She died at Pannonhalma on the 23rd of August 1945, 4 months after arriving. The cause was a stroke, which was the death that the biographies document with the specific precision of a death whose documentation is the documentation of a date and a cause rather than a narrative. Because deaths at 81 at the end of a wartime displacement are not the deaths that produce the extended narratives of protracted final months. She had arrived in April. She had been sheltered by the Benedictines through the spring and summer of the war's final months and the war's ending. She had been present at Pannonhalma for the war's conclusion and for the first weeks of the peace that followed it, the peace that would reorganize Central Europe for the 3rd time in her adult life, this time in the direction of the Soviet sphere rather than the Habsburg one or the Versailles one. She died without seeing Erzsi again. She died without the reconciliation that the 19 years of the distance might have produced, and did not. She died in a monastery in Hungary, sheltered by Benedictines, in the specific condition of someone who has left behind the place they built their life, and who is managing the remaining weeks in the shelter of an institution organized around a different kind of permanence than the permanence of the places people build their lives in. The permanence that Pannonhalma represented was the permanence of a community that had been maintaining its continuous existence since 996, which was a permanence of a different order from the permanence of the Habsburg Empire that had dissolved in 1918, or the permanence of the Rusovce state that the war had ended. And the different order was the order that a woman who had watched two world orders dissolve in her lifetime might have found either comforting or irrelevant, and the record does not specify which she found it. Elemér survived her by less than a year. He died in Budapest on the 20th of July 1946, having spent the months since Stephanie's death in the circumstances that widowhood in post-war Hungary produced for an 82-year-old man whose estate had been in a castle that was now inside the Soviet sphere of influence. He was buried at Pannonhalma beside Stephanie, in the monastery where she had died, and where the community had provided the burial that the circumstances made available, which was the burial of a grave in the monastery's grounds, rather than in the specific dynastic burial tradition that Stephanie's first marriage had associated her with. She was not buried at the Kaisergruft in Vienna, where the Habsburgs lay. She was buried in Hungary, in a Benedictine monastery, beside the man she had chosen, rather than the dynasty she had been assigned to, and the burial's location is the final piece of the account of a life that had spent its second half moving steadily away from the dynasty toward the life the dynasty had not assigned her. The title of this account promised 3 burials, and the promise requires the accounting. Stephanie of Belgium buried Rudolf in January 1889, and she buried Artur Potocki in March 1890, and the third burial is the one that the title kept in reserve and that the preceding 10 parts have been assembling the evidence for. Because the third burial was not the burial of a person, but the burial of the institution that had organized her formation and against which she had spent the second half of her life defining herself. And institutions do not die in a single afternoon the way people do, but over years and decades of accumulated failure and diminishment, and the burial is the burial of something that has been dying for long enough that the death's arrival is the confirmation of a conclusion the available evidence had already established. The Habsburg Empire died on the 11th of November 1918, and Stephanie buried it in the sense that she had been formed by it and had outlived it and had watched it go, which is the specific sense in which the people who are formed by institutions bury them when the institutions end before the people do. The burial of the empire was the burial that cost her the least of the 3, because the empire had spent the preceding 19 years giving her the specific gifts that institutions give the people who escape them, which are the gifts of perspective and distance. And the perspective and distance had produced in her by 1918 the specific quality of someone who could watch the empire's ending without the specific grief of someone who is losing the thing that organized their existence. She had removed the empire from the position of the thing that organized her existence in March 1900, and the removal had given her 18 years of the alternative before the empire's ending, confirmed that the alternative had been the correct direction. Rudolf's burial was the burial that changed everything and cost the most in the short term, and the short term in this case was the decade of the 1890s, the decade of the imprisonment and the Potocki loss and the refused permissions and the court's verdict. He died on the 30th of January 1889, and his death left Stephanie in the specific condition that the note he left her described, and that the note's description, in its cruelty, failed to accurately characterize. She was not delivered. She was trapped more completely than the marriage had trapped her, because the marriage had trapped her inside an institution that still had a function for her, and that still required her to perform the function. And the death had trapped her inside an institution that had no function for her, and that was requiring her to perform the non-function's performance, which was the performance of the appropriate widowhood in an environment that had decided she was to blame for the situation the performance was managing. What Rudolf's burial produced in Stephanie across the decade that followed it was the specific education of someone who had been given, by the worst available means, the information she needed to make the decision she eventually made. The information was the information of what the institution was capable of when the institution had decided who was responsible for its difficulties, which was the information of the refused Belgium permission and the Victoria invitation declined on her behalf, and the Empress Elizabeth's sustained campaign, and the court's social machinery delivering its verdict through the ambient temperature of every room she entered. The education was the education that she had needed to have, in a form that she could not subsequently rationalize or minimize, and the form the institution had provided it in was the form of 19 years of managed hostility, which was a form that rationalization and minimization could not adequately address. The decision she made in 1900 was the decision the education had produced, not the decision of a romantic who had found her person, though she had found him, but the decision of someone who had received, across 19 years, the comprehensive instruction in what the institution did with the people it no longer needed, and who had concluded that the instruction was sufficient reason to arrange her departure before the instruction produced in her the specific condition it had been designed to produce, which was the condition of someone who has been managed into accepting the management as the definition of what was available. Potocki's burial was the most intimate of the three, and the most immediately damaging, because the intimacy was the intimacy of the person rather than the institution, and the person's loss arrived 14 months after Rudolf's death, when the capacity to absorb loss had been taxed by what the preceding 14 months had required of it. He died in March 1890, at 41, of a disease that had no available treatment, in the year that followed the worst year of Stephanie's adult life, and his dying removed from the year's remainder the one available thing that the year had provided, by way of the evidence that the world contained something other than the institution's management of her grief. He had been that evidence. He had been the person who appeared when the institution was managing the grief in the direction of the verdict, and who had provided, through the specific quality of his presence, the counter-evidence of someone who had decided the grief was a human experience, rather than an institutional problem, and who was treating it accordingly. The counter-evidence was what the burial took. Not merely Potocki, who was a man of 41, who had died too young, and whose loss was the loss of a person that the people who loved him experienced as that kind of loss, but the counter-evidence of a world in which the institution's management of her situation was not the whole of what the situation contained, in which there was a room somewhere in which the management was not operating, and in which she could be the person rather than the crown princess, or the dowager crown princess, or the institution's judgment of what those titles required. The burial of Potocki was the burial of the counter-evidence, and the restoration of the counter-evidence after the burial was the project of the following decade, conducted in the travels and the painting lessons and the eventual discovery of Elemér, and it was a project that succeeded, but not until it had demonstrated, through the decade of its necessity, what the burial had cost. What survived the 3 burials, assembled across the 10 parts that have preceded this one, is the account that the burials were not supposed to produce, because the burials were supposed to produce the account of the woman who had been broken by what had broken her, and what the evidence documents instead is the account of the woman who had not been broken and who had understood the surviving of the not breaking as the information most worth communicating to the world when she eventually sat down to communicate it. She communicated it in 1935 in the memoirs, in the specific form of the title's past tense, I was to be empress. The past tense is not the tense of regret, it is the tense of accurate historical statement. She was to be. The being did not happen. What happened instead happened anyway, without the being, and the what happened instead produced the life that the 10 parts have been examining in the terms that the examination produced, which are the terms of someone who looked at the available materials and decided that the construction of a life from them was the available task, and who proceeded with the construction with the specific thoroughness that the preceding parts have documented. The thoroughness is the thing that the Mayerling legend most consistently obscures, because the Mayerling legend requires Stephanie to be organized around Mayerling in the way that the legend is organized around Mayerling, which is to say permanently, retrospectively, as the event that determines the meaning of everything before and after it. The legend is organized that way because legends require the organizing event, the single dramatic moment, that gives the story its shape. Stephanie's life does not have that shape. It has the shape of a life that passed through the organizing event and continued past it for 56 years, in the specific way that lives pass through organizing events and continue past them when the people living them have decided that the continuing is the task rather than the event. 56 years is a long time to continue. It is the time between the morning of the 30th of January 1889 and the morning of the 23rd of August 1945, and what it contains is not the aftermath of Mayerling, but the life that followed Mayerling, which is a different thing, and the difference is the thing that the Mayerling legend required to be suppressed, because the suppression was what the legend needed to remain the legend. A tragic crown princess who was destroyed by her husband's death and who survived in diminished grief until her own was the character the legend had assigned Stephanie, and the character was the character that the Habsburg court had constructed in the months after the hunting lodge's broken door, and that the Viennese social world had maintained across the years of her widowhood, and that the romantic account of the tragedy had inherited and preserved. The character was wrong, not in the specific and limited sense that the character was inaccurate about a detail or two, but in the fundamental sense that the character was organized around the wrong principle, which was the principle that Stephanie's significance was retrospective and institutional, and defined by her proximity to the event, rather than the principle that her significance was prospective and personal, and defined by what she made of the 60 years between the Belgian palace at Laeken in 1864 and the Benedictine monastery at Pannonhalma in 1945. What she made of them is the account this narrative has been assembling, and the assembly produces the portrait of a woman who was warned that marrying a Habsburg was a sentence as much as a ceremony, who wore the dress anyway because she was 16 and had not been given a choice, who received from the sentence everything the sentence was designed to deliver, and who emerged from the receiving with a life organized around the specific lesson that the sentence's terms had, across their application, communicated most clearly. The lesson was the lesson of the institution's priorities and the persons, and the distance between them, and the distance being the space in which the person who survived the institution's management had to construct whatever the institution had not provided, which in Stephanie's case was everything that the 45 years at Rusovce contained. She was warned, and she married a Habsburg anyway, and the Habsburg died in a hunting lodge when she was 24, and the man she loved after the Habsburg died of cancer when she was 25, and the empire that had assigned her both of those fates dissolved when she was 54, and she outlasted all three by decades. And the outlasting was the specific contribution of a person who had decided that the continuing was the task, and who had continued with the thoroughness that the task deserved. The warning she had been given was a warning about a family. The family was real, and the warning was accurate, and the thing the warning was warning her about happened. What the warning could not have anticipated was the person who received it at 16, and who spent the subsequent 81 years converting what the warning had failed to prevent into the evidence that the warning, however accurate about the family, had not been adequate to describe the person who was going to receive its consequences. She wore the dress anyway, and she buried what the dress produced, and she built what the burials left room for. And at 81 in a monastery in Hungary, with the war ending around her and the Second Empire in her lifetime dissolving into its settlement, what she left behind was not the legend that the hunting lodge had produced, but the life that the legend had spent a century trying to be sufficient to describe, and that it was not, and that this account has been attempting to describe in the terms that the life itself, read in the direction that it deserved, provides. The graves are at Pannonhalma, Stephanie's and Elemér's, together, in the grounds of a monastery founded in 996, in Hungary, outside the geography of either empire that organized her formation. The dynasty she was formed by is in the Kaisergruft in Vienna. She is not. The distance between the two burial sites is the distance this account has been measuring from its first sentence, which is the distance between the life she was assigned and the life she built, and the building is what the life was, and the life was sufficient. In 1935, a 71-year-old woman sitting in a castle in Slovakia picked up a pen and began writing the account of her life that the preceding 71 years had been accumulating and that she had been deciding, across those years, whether to write at all. The deciding had taken a long time, not because the material was insufficient, but because the material was more than sufficient, and the question was not what to say, but what the saying would cost, and who would be left to pay the cost when the saying produced its consequences. By 1935, the cost calculation had shifted in the direction of the saying, because the people whose reactions had organized the calculation were mostly dead. Leopold II had been dead since 1909. Empress Elizabeth had been dead since 1898, assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva in a death so random and so violent that it had struck the people who had watched her spend her adult life pursuing danger in the specific form of the death they had always been afraid she was pursuing. Franz Joseph had been dead since 1916. Rudolf had been dead for 46 years. Artur Potocki had been dead for 45. The Habsburg Empire had been dead for 17. The people and the institutions whose living presence had organized the calculation towards silence were no longer present to receive the consequences of the saying, and the people who remained were the people whose reactions Stephanie had decided she could manage. The memoir was written in French, which was the language of the Belgian court in which she had been formed, and the language of the educated European class of her generation, and it was published under the title Je devais être impératrice, which translates as I was to be empress, and the title is the whole argument of the book in 4 words. The past tense carries the weight. Je devais, I was to be, I was supposed to be, the grammatical construction of a destiny that was assigned and that did not happen, that was taken from her, or that she took from herself, depending on which portion of the book's account the reader has most recently processed. The title does not say, I wanted to be empress, which would have been the title of a different kind of memoir, organized around a different kind of loss. It says I was to be, which is the title of someone describing what was planned for her, rather than what she wanted. And the distinction between the planned and the wanted is the distinction that the 71 years had produced in someone who had spent the first half of them inside the plan and the second half outside it. The book's reception was the reception of a memoir whose author was simultaneously famous and obscure, which is the specific condition of someone who was at the center of one of the century's most discussed events and who has spent the subsequent decades in the careful privacy of a life conducted away from the discussion's continuation. Vienna knew who Stephanie was. The European press knew who Stephanie was. The reading public of 1935, which was the reading public that had grown up with the Mayerling legend as one of the standard romantic tragedies of the preceding half-century, knew who Stephanie was in the specific way that the public knows the peripheral figures of famous events, which is as the context for the event, rather than as a person in their own right. The memoir proposed to revise the context into the person, and the revision was received with the specific mixture of interest and resistance that revisions of famous events receive when the revision comes from the person who has most consistently been assigned the role of the supporting character. The interest was commercial and immediate. The memoir sold. It was translated and serialized and reviewed across the European press in the way that books by people who were present at historically significant events are reviewed, which is with the specific attention organized around the question of what the person has revealed rather than what the person has written, because the public's investment in the event is the investment in the revelation rather than in the literary quality of the revealing. What Stephanie had revealed, by the standards of the 1935 reading public's appetite for revelation about Mayerling, was considerable. The brutality of the wedding night, described in the memoir with the word that this account's second part examined, was a revelation in the specific sense that the romantic legend of Rudolf and Mary Wetzera had never required the examination of what Rudolf had been like as a husband, and the examination Stephanie provided was the examination of someone who had been in the position to know, and who had decided that the knowing was now worth sharing. The syphilis was not named in the memoir. This is the piece of the memoir's candor that requires the most careful examination, because the not naming is the most significant editorial decision in the book, more significant than anything the memoir said, because what the memoir did not say about the disease that Rudolf transmitted to his wife is the information that would have reorganized the Mayerling legend most completely if it had been said. The memoir described the consequences, the infertility, the gynecological damage, the permanent physical alteration of a 20-year-old woman's body by a disease her husband had given her. It described the consequences in terms that a reader of 1935, with adequate medical knowledge, could assemble into the correct diagnosis without the diagnosis being stated. But it did not state the diagnosis, and the not stating was the editorial decision of someone who understood that the stating would convert the memoir from the account of a woman's life into a medical document about a crown prince's disease, and that the conversion would organize every subsequent discussion of the memoir around the disease rather than around the life, and that the disease's organization of the discussion was not the organization she was writing the memoir to produce. What she was writing the memoir to produce was something more precise and more personal than the revelation about Rudolf, and the precision and the personality of the intention is visible in the portions of the memoir that the 1935 reviews found least commercially interesting and that the subsequent decades have found most humanly significant. These were the portions about Elemér, the Habsburg formation and the Rudolf marriage and the Potocki loss, and the widowhood's managed hostility occupied the memoir's first two-thirds, and they occupied it with the candor and the detail that a woman describing the worst decades of her adult life produces when she has decided that the description is warranted. The final third described the life at Rusovce, and the describing was the describing of someone who had spent 35 years in the possession of something she had not had before, and who was attempting to communicate what the having of it actually felt like to a readership whose understanding of her life had been organized entirely around what she had lost. The communication was the most difficult piece of the writing, because the vocabulary of ordinary happiness is the vocabulary that the literary tradition has developed least thoroughly, organized as it is around the drama of suffering and the narrative of catastrophe, rather than around the daily texture of two people who have found each other and who are managing a large estate in Slovakia, and who read in the evenings, and who notice the quality of the light at certain hours from certain windows. Stephanie attempted the communication anyway, in the specific terms of the specific pleasures she had found available at Rusovce, and the attempt produced the passages that the memoir's most careful readers have consistently identified as its most honest, because they were the passages written without the structural support of the dramatic event, without the Mayerling or the Potocki death or the chapel scene or the Franz Ferdinand irony to organize the narrative around, and what they produced in the absence of the dramatic event was the account of a life conducted in the specific register of the person rather than the historical figure. Vienna's reaction to the memoir was the reaction of a city that had been the center of the Mayerling legend's production and maintenance for 46 years, and that found in the memoir's account of the court's treatment of Stephanie the specific quality of the indictment that an indictment produced by an eyewitness always carries. The court that had refused Belgium, that had declined the Victoria invitation, that had delivered the verdict through the Empress's sustained campaign, was the court that the memoir described, and the describing was the describing of someone who had been inside the court and who was now outside it, and who had the specific advantage of the outside position, which was the advantage of the person who no longer required the institution's approval and who could therefore describe the institution in the terms that the institution's management of her had produced, rather than the terms that the institution's approval required. The Habsburg nostalgists who reviewed the memoir in the Viennese press of 1935 received it with the specific discomfort of people who had organized their understanding of the Mayerling tragedy around the version that the tragedy's institutional management had produced, and who were now being offered a version that the institutional management had spent 46 years preventing from being the available version. The discomfort expressed itself in the review's characteristic move of treating Stephanie's account as the account of a bitter woman, rather than the account of an accurate one, which was the move that the institutional management had always made, and that the institutional management's absence had not prevented the institutional management's inheritors from continuing to make. The bitter woman framing was the framing that the memoir most directly challenged, and the challenge was mounted not through the specific argument against the framing, but through the specific quality of the memoir's tone, which was not the tone of bitterness, but the tone of the accurate historical statement, delivered by someone who had processed the preceding 71 years with the specific thoroughness of someone for whom the processing had been the primary intellectual occupation of the decades that the memoir was now summarizing. Bitterness is the emotion of someone who has not processed what happened to them, who is carrying the wound in its original form rather than in the form that the processing converts it to, which is the form of the understanding. Stephanie had processed. The processing had taken decades and had required the specific conditions of Rusovce and Elemér and the ordinary life that the processing needed, and what it had produced by 1935 was the understanding that the memoir was attempting to communicate, which was the understanding of what the Habsburg court had been, and what it had done, and why it had done it, and what the doing of it had cost the person it had been done to. The understanding was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was not the register the memoir occupied or attempted to occupy, because forgiveness requires the acknowledgement of what is being forgiven, and the Habsburg court had never provided the acknowledgement and was in no position to provide it in 1935, being 17 years dissolved. What the memoir provided instead was the accurate account, and the accurate account was the account that the court had spent 46 years preventing from being the available account, and its availability in 1935 was the availability of something that had been managed against and that had survived the management because the person who carried it had survived the management and had survived it in the specific way that this account has been tracing across its preceding 11 parts, which was the way of someone who had decided that the continuing was the task and who had continued. The memoir's final pages described Rusovce in the autumn, which was the season that the estate produced most completely in the form of the specific pleasures she had been communicating across the final third. The harvest completed, the Danube visible from the eastern windows in the specific quality of the October light, Elemér in the library, the ordinary day. She wrote about the ordinary day with the appreciation that 71 years of the specific education this account has documented had produced in her, and the writing was the writing of someone who understood what the ordinary day was worth because she had spent the first half of her life without adequate access to it, and who was communicating the worth in the specific terms of someone who had arrived at it through the route that the preceding portions of the memoir had established. The book ended there, in the autumn at Rusovce, 10 years before the Red Army and the monastery and the grave beside Elemér's, and what it ended with was the accurate statement of what the life she had built contained, which was the ordinary day in the October light, and the ordinary day was the answer to the title's past tense. The thing that the I was to be empress had become when the being empress had not happened, and the becoming something else had happened instead. She was to be empress. She became the woman who wrote the book about what happened when she wasn't, and the book was the account she had spent 71 years earning the right to write, and that she wrote with the specific authority of someone who had lived every sentence of it. The book is still in print. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.